Iron Horse Wars. A Wild Western Action Thriller. Chapter 1. The surveying rod slipped in Rip Campbell's hands, and he caught it before it tumbled down the mountainside. Behind him, Tom Bradley laughed from the ledge where he was anchoring the transit. "You're getting old, Rip." "I'm getting cold," Rip said. "There's a difference." It was February in the Colorado high country, the kind of cold that made your fingers forget their purpose. Snow covered the peaks above them and the passes below, but the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad didn't wait for spring weather. Progress didn't recognize seasons. Rip planted the rod on the flat survey point and turned to look at Tom across the 30 yards of treacherous slope between them. Tom was checking the transit angles, squinting through the eyepiece with his tongue poking out slightly, a habit that made him look younger than his 30-some years. "What's McMurtry say about the grade?" Tom called. "He says we build it, or we don't eat." Rip was already noting the measurements in his leather journal, his pencil moving quickly despite the cold. "He's got maps back at camp, showing the Atchison people have 3 crews out on the Spanish Peaks route. Says they're moving faster than we are." "The Atchison people," Tom repeated. "That's rich." It was what everyone called them now. Not the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe, but the Atchison people, as if they were a separate species altogether. The way Tom said it suggested they were something worse than that. "McMurtry brought in a man from back east," Rip said. "Fellow named Robinson. A. Robinson. Worked for the Rio Grande before, but jumped to the Atchison last year. McMurtry says Robinson's the one pushing them hard on the mountain routes." "Robinson," Tom said. "We supposed to remember that name?" "Probably." They worked in silence for a while, taking sightings and measurements, marking the terrain that would eventually become a railroad grade, if the Denver and Rio Grande had the money and the will to see it through. The company was young, hungry, already overextended according to the railroad men who gathered in the saloons and talked more than they should. General Palmer had visions of dominating Colorado's mountain passes, but vision didn't buy rails or pay workers. The sun was sliding behind the western peaks when they packed up. The journey back to camp took 2 hours, mostly downhill but treacherous with snow and loose rock. They picked their way carefully, leading their horses through passages where a misstep meant a drop that would finish you before you hit the bottom. The camp occupied a wide flat in a canyon, with canvas tents arranged in military precision. McMurtry believed in order the way some men believed in God. The mess tent was in the center, the supply depot to the east, sleeping tents in lines, and the horses in a rope enclosure to the north where some local men watched them for wages. McMurtry himself stood near the fire with a map spread across a plank table. He was a compact man with a mustache that curled up at the ends and eyes that rarely blinked. When he looked at you, you got the feeling he was measuring you for a coffin. "You get the benchmark?" he asked as Rip approached. "Got it. Marked it on the stone like you said." "What about the grade?" "Grade runs pretty steady, between 11 and 13% until you hit that break in the ridge. After that it improves some." McMurtry nodded, not satisfied but not disappointed either. He bent over the map, running his finger along a line he'd already drawn. "The Atchison people came through here 3 weeks ago, according to the locals." "Through the canyon?" Tom asked. "Through this exact canyon. Their surveyor, fellow named Morley, camped not far from here. Probably within 10 miles, given the terrain." McMurtry looked up from the map. "I want you both riding west at first light tomorrow. Don't stop for anything. The passes north of here are the key to everything. Whoever gets there first, whoever files the claim, that's whose railroad goes through. Understand?" Rip understood. He'd been working for the Rio Grande for 2 years, and he understood that the company was betting its future on controlling Colorado's mountain passages. Without the passes, the rails would have to go around, adding hundreds of miles and making the whole enterprise pointless. With the passes, they could reach the mining camps. With the mining camps, they could move silver. That night, the men sat around the fire eating beans and hard biscuits. Someone had brought whiskey from Denver, and it passed around. The talk turned to money, as it always did. The Leadville silver boom was pulling men north like a magnet. There were fortunes being made there, fortunes the size of cities, and the railroad companies knew it. Whoever connected Denver to Leadville first owned Colorado. "My cousin works for the Atchison now," one of the surveyors said. He was a thin man named Colby with fingers stained from tobacco. "He says they're planning something big. Says Robinson's been given unlimited funding to beat us to the northern passes." "What does unlimited funding get you when you can't move in the snow?" someone else asked. "It gets you fast horses," Colby said. "It gets you enough men so that even if half of them freeze, you've still got more than the other fellow." Rip listened without contributing. He was thinking about tomorrow, about riding west into country he'd never seen, looking for passes that might be there or might not be. He was thinking about the Atchison people and their unlimited funding. He was thinking about McMurtry's eyes and the way they measured you for a coffin. Tom sat down beside him on a log. "You think they're really coming after the northern passes?" Tom asked quietly. "I think," Rip said, "that we're about to find out." The fire crackled and threw sparks up into the darkness. Above them, the stars were cold and distant, burning through the Colorado night like they'd been burning for 1,000 years and would burn for 1,000 more. The railroad would change that, eventually. The railroad would bring lights to the mountains and tracks where there were now only trails. Progress would come, whether the mountains wanted it or not. "We should get some sleep," Tom said. They rose and walked toward the sleeping tents. Behind them, the conversation continued around the fire. Talk of money and passes and corporate wars coming to the Colorado high country. The men gathered there couldn't know yet that the competition they were beginning to feel would become something much larger, something that would pull in politicians and gunfighters and railroad barons before it was done. They couldn't know that the simple question of who got to build through which mountain pass would eventually cost more than money. But they suspected it. In the way men suspect coming storms, they suspected it. Chapter 2. The horses climbed the pass in the gray light before dawn. Rip and Tom rode single file, their breath visible in the cold air, the sound of hooves on frozen ground the only noise for miles. McMurtry had given them directions to a man named Wooten, who controlled Raton Pass, a man who collected tolls the way other men collected debts. They reached the pass by midday. It was narrower than Rip expected, a gap between two ridges with barely room for a wagon, much less a railroad grade. But it was the only gap. North and south, the mountains rose like walls. Wooten's station sat at the highest point, a low structure of stone and wood with a corral attached. Smoke rose from a chimney. Rip counted 3 men visible near the corral, all armed, all watching the approach. Tom reined in beside Rip. "You think we announce ourselves or just ride in?" "We announce ourselves." They came on at a walk, keeping their hands visible. The men at the corral didn't move. As Rip and Tom got closer, one of them, a tall man with a scarred face, stepped forward with his hand resting on his belt. "You're lost," he said. It wasn't a question. "We're looking for Mr. Wooten," Rip said. The scarred man turned and called toward the station. "Uncle Dick." A man emerged from the doorway, and Rip understood immediately why they called him Uncle Dick. He was ancient, not just old, but weathered into something that barely resembled human skin. His face was a map of wrinkles, his beard hung to his chest in gray tangles, and he moved like a man who'd learned to conserve every motion because wasting energy meant dying. "Well," Uncle Dick said, his voice like gravel in a box, "what brings surveyors to my pass?" He knew what they were before they'd said anything. Rip filed that away. "We're working for the Denver and Rio Grande," Rip said, mapping the route through. Uncle Dick nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. He pointed to the ground. "You're standing on my property. I own this pass, the crown of the mountain down to the base. Everything you see belongs to me." "We know it," Tom said. "Do you now?" Uncle Dick walked toward them, each step careful. Up close, he smelled like tobacco and wood smoke, and something else Rip couldn't place. His eyes were bright, though. Sharp. "Then you know you owe me for being here." "We're surveyors," Rip said. "Just looking at the terrain." "Looking costs the same as walking," Uncle Dick said. "Everything costs. I've got a toll road here, been running it for years. Stagecoaches, freight wagons, people like yourselves trying to move through my property. Everything pays." "How much?" Tom asked. 50 cents per horse." Tom laughed. "That's robbery." "Yes," Uncle Dick agreed. "It is. But you're on my property. You can pay 50 cents or you can turn around. Those are the choices God gave you, and I'm not in a position to offer better." Rip pulled out his coin purse and extracted 2 coins. He handed them down to Uncle Dick, who took them and examined them in the pale light. "Denver and Rio Grande," Uncle Dick said, turning one of the coins over. "That's General Palmer's outfit. Ambitious man, Palmer. Wants to own the mountains." "Everyone wants to own something," Rip said. "True enough." Uncle Dick pocketed the coins. "But wanting and owning are different matters. I've been up here 30 years, and I've seen ambitious men come and go. The mountains don't care who owns them. They just sit here and break tools and freeze blood and collect payment from fools trying to conquer them." Tom dismounted and walked toward the station, following the scarred man who'd guided him inside without being asked. Rip stayed with Uncle Dick. "The Atchison people," Rip said. "They come through here?" "That's the other railroad," Uncle Dick said. It wasn't an answer, but it was a confirmation. "They come through recently?" Uncle Dick studied him for a long moment. "They'll be here tomorrow or the next day. Maybe the day after that. They move slow when they're trying to be sneaky. They'll send one man first, probably. A scout to see what we've got and how much it costs to use it. They'll pay your toll." "Of course they'll pay," Uncle Dick said. "Everybody pays. I'm not in business to turn away customers, and I don't care which railroad company thinks they own the future. They all think they own it. That's what makes them railroad companies." He started walking back toward the station. "Your friend's getting whiskey inside. You can join him if you want. Or you can look at the pass all you want. I don't care. Just understand, when your railroad comes through here, if it comes through here, I'll still be standing on this mountain collecting my toll. Long after you and your surveyors are gone, long after the Denver and Rio Grande and the Atchison have fought themselves into ghosts, I'll be here." He went inside and closed the door. Rip stood looking at the pass, thinking about the man who owned it. There was something in Uncle Dick's manner that suggested he might be right. He'd been here 30 years. He'd probably be here 30 more, collecting tolls from ambitious companies who thought the mountains were something you could own and control and turn into profit. Tom emerged from the station carrying a cup of whiskey. He handed it to Rip. "He's a hell of a character," Tom said. "Says the Atchison man came through 5 days ago. Offered to make some kind of deal with him." "What kind of deal?" "Didn't say. Just said the Atchison man was younger than you and hungrier than the rest of us." Rip looked back at the station. The sun was moving down, and the shadows in the pass were getting longer. Tomorrow or the next day, a man from the Atchison would ride up this mountain to look at this gap and figure out how to get a railroad through it. And Uncle Dick would take his toll. We should head back, Rip said. They rode down the mountain as the light faded, leaving the pass to its owner and his broken independent logic. Neither of them spoke much on the ride. There was nothing to say. They'd found the pass, and now they knew it existed, and now they knew that someone else knew it too. Chapter 3. McMurtry didn't sleep. Rip knew this because he woke at 3 a.m. to find the chief engineer sitting at the plank table with a lantern and a bottle of whiskey, studying the same maps he'd been studying for 2 days. "You're awake," McMurtry said. It wasn't a question. "You sent word an hour ago." "I did." McMurtry poured whiskey into a tin cup and pushed it across the table. "The Atchison man reached Wooten's Pass this afternoon. Robinson himself. He's making a deal with Wooten. Guaranteed payment, supplies for the station, a cut of the future tolls." Rip sat down and didn't touch the whiskey. "What kind of deal?" "The kind that means Robinson's going to start grading at first light." McMurtry leaned back in his chair. "Wooten told one of our men about it. Said Robinson promised him 3 times what we were paying for passage. Said Robinson knew what he was worth." "Did Robinson come alone?" "No. He brought 8 workers and 2 teams of horses. They're camped 2 miles below the pass." McMurtry's fingers drummed against the table. "We can beat him. Not by much and not by working smart, but we can beat him. It's 2 a.m. "I know what time it is." McMurtry stood and walked to the tent flap, looking out at the dark camp. The fires had burned down to embers. Most of the men were sleeping. In a few hours, they'd wake to another day of routine survey work and slow progress, and the knowledge that they were losing ground to competitors. "I want you to ride to Raton Pass," McMurtry said. "You and Tom, and 5 of the best workers we have. Bring tools. Bring stakes. Bring everything you need to mark a grade. I want you there by dawn. Robinson will have an 8-hour advantage. Then you'll have to work fast." McMurtry turned from the tent flap. "I'm sending a message to Palmer right now. By afternoon, we'll have more men moving north. By tomorrow night, we'll have 30 people on that pass. We won't be able to stop Robinson from grading, but we can make sure our claim is staked deeper than his." Rip understood what McMurtry wasn't saying. In railroad disputes, the first company to actually begin work on a route had the strongest legal position. If both companies started grading simultaneously, it became a question of which one's claim was older, which one had filed first, which one could convince a judge they'd intended to build there before the other fellow ever thought about it. "You want us to file the claim," Rip said. "I want you to make it so undeniable that all the lawyers in Denver couldn't untangle it." Tom was easier to wake than Rip expected. He was already dressed and waiting by the time Rip got to his tent. "McMurtry told you." "He told me an hour ago," Tom said. "He's been planning this since yesterday." They selected 5 men, good workers, strong backs, experienced with tools and terrain. One of them, a man named Garrett, carried a pistol low on his hip and had the look of someone who'd done more than survey work in his life. McMurtry didn't ask questions about backgrounds. They left the camp at 4 a.m, riding hard through darkness. The horses knew the way now, having traveled the route twice already. The trail was treacherous but familiar. Rip kept his attention on the ground ahead, following the sound of Tom's horse and the movement of the workers behind him. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when they reached the lower approach to the pass. They could see smoke rising from Robinson's camp, maybe half a mile south. Activity. Men moving in the pre-dawn gloom. "They know we're coming," Garrett said. "They don't know how many of us there are," Rip said. They rode the rest of the way at a gallop, their horses laboring on the steep terrain. The pass opened in front of them, just as the sun broke across the ridge. The light was sudden and sharp, turning everything to black outline and yellow glow. Robinson had already started. He had 4 men with picks and shovels, working on a grade that ran up the center of the pass. The work was crude but deliberate, clearing rocks and loose soil, establishing what would become the roadbed. Robinson himself stood watching, a tall man with a gray hat and the kind of face that suggested he smiled rarely. He turned as Rip and his crew rode up, his expression not changing. "This ground's claimed," Robinson said. "Not yet," Rip said. He dismounted and walked directly to a flat spot 30 yards up from where Robinson's men were working. The other Denver and Rio Grande workers dispersed, pulling stakes and hammers from their packs. They worked with practiced efficiency, driving markers into the ground in a line that cut across the pass at a slight angle to Robinson's intended grade. Robinson watched without speaking. His men kept working. The 2 teams of horses with Denver and Rio Grande markings stood tied to a rock outcropping, waiting. "You're wasting time," Robinson said to Rip. "Palmer's company is finished. You know it, and I know it." Rip drove another stake into the ground. "Tell that to the judge." "There won't be a judge," Robinson said. "There'll be a race. And we'll be in front of you, from here to Leadville." By 9 in the morning, Rip's crew had marked the entire pass with claim stakes, each one placed and hammered with deliberate permanence. The stakes were crude, wooden things that any man could remove with an axe, but they represented something stronger than wood. They represented intention. They represented a company willing to fight for what it wanted. Robinson pulled his men out around noon. He left his tools scattered and didn't offer any parting words. He simply gathered his workers and rode south, his silhouette rising and falling against the afternoon sky until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Tom came to stand beside Rip, looking at the stakes and the pass and the mountains rising on either side. "We won," Tom said. "We marked it," Rip said. "Winning comes later." Chapter 4. The Atchison men arrived in Trinidad on a Tuesday with rifles and the kind of confidence that comes from being paid to hurt people. Rip saw them from the window of the surveyor's office where he was filing claim documents. They rode in formation, 6 of them, all wearing the same expression, bored and dangerous. "Don't stare," Tom said from across the room. "I'm not staring." "You're staring." Rip turned away from the window. Tom was spreading maps across a desk, pretending to work, but his shoulders were rigid. Outside, the sound of horses being dismounted, spurs dragging on wooden boardwalk. "They're setting up at the saloon," Tom said. "I heard at breakfast they've got a room there. The whole Atchison operation is operating out of the Copper Dollar now." "Who told you that?" "The bartender. Says they've been drinking water instead of whiskey. Says they're professional about it, which is worse than if they got drunk." Rip walked to the desk and looked at the maps. The claim stakes they'd planted at Raton Pass were marked in red. Robinson's competing grade line was marked in blue. The 2 lines didn't cross. The Denver and Rio Grande had won the spatial advantage, even if the legal battle was far from over. A knock came at the office door. Before anyone could answer, it opened. The man who entered was built like a railroad tie and had the scarred knuckles of someone who'd settled arguments with his fists before guns became convenient. His face was angular, jaw working against itself as if chewing something invisible. He looked at Rip and Tom without blinking. "McMurdery around?" he asked. "At the camp," Rip said. "North Pass, 2 days' ride." "Then I'm talking to you." The man pulled out a chair and sat without being invited. "Name's Cobb. I'm working for the Atchison. And I'm here to tell you that your claim on Raton Pass isn't worth the wood it's staked on." "It's registered," Tom said. "Registration doesn't mean shit when it's the wrong registration." Cobb leaned back in the chair, which creaked under his weight. "Robinson's filing a counterclaim tomorrow based on survey work he did 2 weeks before your man ever set foot on that pass." "That's a lie," Tom said. Cobb's eyes moved to Tom slowly, as if Tom was something Cobb was seeing for the first time and finding it mildly interesting. "It doesn't matter if it's a lie. What matters is Robinson's got documents, and you've got stakes in the ground. Judges like documents." Rip kept his voice level. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand the situation," Cobb said. "The Atchisons got resources that make the Denver and Rio Grande look like a mining operation. We've got money for lawyers. We've got money for judges. We've got money for whatever it takes to move those stakes you planted. If we move them, we're giving up the pass," Tom said. "That's right," Cobb said. "You are." Tom stood. "Get out." Cobb didn't move. He continued to lean back in the chair, his scarred hands resting on his thighs. "There's 2 ways this goes," he said. "Either you voluntarily cede the pass to Robinson's counterclaim and move your operation south, or things get complicated." "Complicated how?" Rip asked. "Complicated like your surveying crews get jumped in the mountains. Complicated like your supply wagons get raided. Complicated like your workers are too scared to show up for shifts because they know what happens when the Atchison doesn't get what it wants." He stood finally, the chair scraping backward. He looked at both of them, taking his time with it. "McMurtry needs to understand that this isn't about surveying anymore. It's about whether his company has the stomach for a real fight." He left without waiting for a response, his spurs jingling against the floorboards, the sound of them fading as he walked down the street. Tom and Rip didn't speak for a long moment. Outside, the town sounds continued: horses, voices, the distant sound of someone hammering metal. Normal commerce, normal life, none of it changed by the conversation that had just taken place in this small room. "We send word to McMurtry," Tom said. "Of course we do. He'll want to fight." "He will," Rip said. "But we don't have 6 men who know how to fight like Cobb does." A messenger rode out that evening, carrying a letter to McMurtry. Rip watched him go, a young man on a fast horse, moving north toward the mountain camps where the real survey work was happening. By the time McMurtry read the letter, it would be 2 days old. By the time he responded, another 2 days would pass. The Atchison didn't work on that kind of timeline. The next morning, Tom didn't show up at the office. Rip found him at the doctor's place, sitting on a bench outside with his left eye swollen shut and his lips split. His knuckles were scraped raw and bloodied, and he was smiling like he'd won something. "How many?" Rip asked. 4 of them, Tom said. "Found them outside the saloon around midnight. They wanted to discuss the pass situation a little more." "You took on 4 of them?" "I got 2 solid before the other 2 landed anything worth counting." Tom held up his swollen hand. "Cobb's on the 2nd floor of the saloon with his ribs wrapped. I heard he might be there a while." Rip felt something move in his chest, something between anger and respect, and the beginning of understanding that this conflict had already started, whether McMurtry was ready or not. The stakes in the ground were just the beginning. The real war was happening now, in dark streets and behind saloon doors, fought by men who understood that corporate disputes eventually became personal. "McMurtry needs to know," Rip said. "Let him guess," Tom said. "I think we just did his guessing for him." Chapter 5. The silver was the only reason any of this mattered. Without Leadville's silver, Raton Pass was just a mountain crossing, useful for moving freight but not worth fighting over. Rip understood this by the time he reached the mining town in March, riding north with Tom and 2 engineers McMurtry had sent specifically to evaluate the Leadville route. The town itself looked like it had been dropped by accident onto the mountainside. Buildings rose in chaotic sprawl, saloons and brothels and supply houses and assay offices all competing for space. The streets ran at odd angles following the terrain, and everything smelled like ore dust and horse manure and human desperation. "Christ," Tom said, looking around. "How many people are here?" "More arriving every day," one of the engineers, a man named Walsh, said. "The silver started flowing last year, and it hasn't stopped. They're pulling ore out faster than they can process it." They rode directly to the assay office. McMurtry had given Rip a letter of introduction to the office manager, a man named Hutchins, who'd been receiving reports on the railroad situation from Denver. Hutchins sat behind a desk covered in ledgers and assay reports, his fingers stained with chemical burns. "The Atchison thinks they have the advantage," Hutchins said after reading the letter. He leaned back in his chair, which was actually a decent chair, suggesting business was good. "They control Raton Pass, which means they can bring freight from the south without worrying about terrain. But Leadville's north and west. Raton doesn't help you get here efficiently." "And the Royal Gorge does," Rip said. "The Royal Gorge is the only practical route for the north approach." Hutchins gestured to a map on his wall. "You see this? The Arkansas River cuts through a canyon that's nearly a mile deep in places. The only way a railroad gets through is following the riverbed itself. Whoever owns the gorge owns access to Leadville from Denver." "What's it worth?" Tom asked. Hutchins smiled like Tom had asked a question he'd been waiting for. "Last month, a mining company here shipped $300,000 in silver. 1 month. The Denver and Rio Grande carries that freight, they make a fortune. The Atchison carries it, they make a fortune. The company that can't access Leadville makes nothing." Walsh was already studying the map, tracing the river's path with his finger. "How many feasible grades through the gorge?" "1," Hutchins said. "Maybe 2, if you're willing to blast half the canyon and take twice as long. The Denver and Rio Grande surveyors came through here 2 weeks ago. They claim they found a route in 72. "Do they have documentation?" Rip asked. "Documentation doesn't matter if they abandoned it," Hutchins said. "That's what the Atchison will argue. That's what the lawyers will fight about. But here's what matters: whoever gets to the gorge first and starts building wins. The lawyers can argue after the rails are down." Rip left the assay office with a map and the beginning of a different understanding of the conflict. It wasn't really about Raton Pass. Raton was important, but it was secondary. The real prize was Leadville, and the only route to Leadville that made sense was through the Royal Gorge. He wanted to see it. They found Ellen Morrison at her father's freight office near the mining supply district. She was working at a desk, making notes in a ledger when Rip walked in. She looked up and her expression changed, surprise first, then something else that Rip couldn't quite read. "Mr. Campbell," she said, setting down her pen. "I wasn't expecting to see you in Leadville." "My work brought me north," Rip said. Ellen Morrison was the daughter of a successful businessman, but she worked like a man, managing her father's freight operations with the kind of precision that suggested she understood numbers and logistics better than most. She was tall, with dark hair, and a way of looking at people that made them feel examined. "You've come to see the gorge," she said. It wasn't a question. "Eventually." "It's impressive," Ellen said. "My father took me there last week. He's trying to decide whether to bid on a contract to supply whichever railroad wins the route. He thinks whoever controls the gorge controls Colorado." "He's probably right," Rip said. "That doesn't seem to bother you," Ellen said. "Most men I talk to get excited about the money. You look like you're thinking about something else." Rip considered how to answer. Around them, men moved through the freight office conducting business, buying and selling, negotiating rates, discussing shipments. The silver was moving through this town like blood through veins, and Ellen's father was one of the men profiting from the flow. "I'm thinking about who pays for it," Rip said. All this money moving through here, all these fortunes being made. Someone's always paying for that. Ellen set her pen down carefully. The miners pay for it with their lives. The railroad workers pay for it with their backs. The companies pay for it with their pride. She paused. And people like my father pay for it with their souls, if we're being poetic about it. Are we? No, Ellen said. We're being practical. The silver is here. The railroads want it. Everything else is just the details. Rip arranged to see the Royal Gorge 2 days later, with Ellen as his guide. She knew the route from her father's territory surveys, and she knew the risks, the narrow paths, the river dropping below you, the sense that the canyon wanted to crush anything that tried to move through it. They stood on a ridge overlooking the gorge in late afternoon, the shadows deep purple in the canyon, and the river moving like a silver thread below. There's only room for one railroad, Ellen said. I know, Rip said. Then you know what that means. Rip watched the river move through the gorge, thinking about money and stakes and the way corporate ambition turned reasonable men into enemies. He thought about Tom's swollen eye and Cobb's scarred knuckles, and the fact that this beautiful canyon would become a battlefield before either company was done with it. It means someone's going to die, Rip said. Yes, Ellen said. They are. Chapter 6. The canyon walls rose like the sides of a grave. Rip stood at the overlook with Walsh and 3 workers, looking down at the Arkansas River, threading through the gorge nearly 1,000 feet below. The rock was rust-colored in the morning light, banded with darker stone that looked like it had been squeezed by something immense. How wide at the bottom? Walsh asked. One of the workers, a man named Garrett who'd been with them since Trinidad, threw a stone over the edge and watched it fall. Maybe 50 feet where the water is. Less in most places. Walsh knelt at the rim and pulled out a notebook, beginning to sketch the grade lines and calculate angles. He worked with the precision of a man who'd done this 100 times, reducing the canyon's grandeur to mathematics and measurements. 1 track, Walsh said without looking up. 2 at most if you widen the riverbed. But that means blasting and the water would slow you down. 1 track is better. 1 track is faster to build. Rip walked along the rim, following the river's path, trying to understand how an engineer's mind translated terrain into possibility. The canyon twisted, sometimes opening into wider sections, sometimes narrowing, until the rock seemed to press close enough to touch from both sides simultaneously. High above, eagles circled in the thermals rising from the depths. The Atchison will see this the same way we do, Walsh said, approaching Rip with his notebook full of sketches. 1 track. No choice. That's why whoever gets here first wins. And if both companies get here at the same time? Rip asked. Then you fight, Walsh said. You fight and you build, and you hope the law sides with you when the lawyers come calling. They rode back to Leadville in the late afternoon, taking the longer route to avoid the steeper paths that would slow the horses. The town looked different to Rip, now that he understood what was at stake. Every saloon represented money won or lost. Every supply house was potential profit or ruin. The chaos that had seemed random before now appeared as a kind of organized desperation, everyone trying to position themselves to profit from whatever railroad won the gorge. Ellen was waiting at her father's office when Rip arrived. You saw it, she said. Not a question. I saw it. And Rip sat on the edge of her desk. And it's going to be beautiful when it's finished. And it's going to be ugly getting it finished. Ellen set down her pen and walked to the window that overlooked the town. My father received an offer today. From the Atchison. They want to contract with him to supply their construction crews if they win the gorge route. He's going to take it. Why tell me? Because I thought you should know that my father's loyalty is to profit, not to either railroad. She turned to face him. And because you need to understand that men like my father will help whoever pays them. The Denver and Rio Grande could make the same offer, and he'd take both contracts, or he'd drop the Atchison and go with you. It depends entirely on which company makes the better offer. That's practical, Rip said. That's business, Ellen said. My father will profit from the gorge route, regardless of which company builds it. He's already profiting from the uncertainty. The longer the two railroads fight, the more he makes selling supplies and negotiating between them. Rip considered this. It hadn't occurred to him that the conflict itself could be profitable, that men might benefit from the war rather than from its resolution. What do you want? Rip asked. I want you to understand the landscape you're operating in, Ellen said. It's not just about surveying and building. It's about money flowing in directions that don't appear on any of your maps. It's about men like my father who profit from chaos, and men like Cobb who profit from violence, and men like you who try to do honest work and end up caught between them. She walked back to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a piece of paper that was creased from folding. She handed it to Rip without comment. It was a letter written in a formal hand, offering the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad the services of Morrison Freight and Supply for the construction of the Royal Gorge route. The contract terms were listed precisely, with pricing that undercut what Rip assumed the Atchison was offering. My father asked me to give this to you, Ellen said. He wants the Denver and Rio Grande to know that he's available, on better terms than the competition. He also wants you to know that he's aware of the other offer, and he's willing to switch sides if the price moves. Your father's honest about being dishonest, Rip said. My father's honest about the fact that honor is a luxury men like him can't afford, Ellen said. And he's pragmatic enough to know that the Denver and Rio Grande need supply contracts more than the Atchison does, because the Atchison already has resources behind it. The Rio Grande needs local support. Rip folded the letter and put it in his pocket. What does he want from me? He wants you to carry this to McMurtry. He wants to know if the Rio Grande can match or beat the Atchison's offer. And he wants an answer before the end of the month, because by then he'll need to commit one way or another. And what do you want? Ellen didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window again at the town and the mountains and the silver wealth flowing through Leadville like electricity. I want you to understand that this is bigger than surveying, she said finally. The gorge is beautiful, but beauty doesn't matter in a war. What matters is the network of men supporting you. Suppliers, judges, gunfighters, politicians. What matters is knowing who's profitable and who isn't. Your company's going to lose if all you've got is good intentions and good surveying. Is your father going to help us? My father will help whoever pays better, Ellen said. That's the difference between my father and people like you. He knows what side he's on, his own. Chapter 7. McMurtry arrived at Cañon City on April 17th with 30 workers and a letter from General Palmer that gave him authority to do whatever necessary to secure the Royal Gorge. He read the letter aloud to Rip and Tom at breakfast in the hotel restaurant, not bothering to keep his voice down. Palmer says we own the route, McMurtry said, folding the letter carefully. Says his surveys from '72 constitute prior claim. Says if the Atchison contests it, we take them to court and bury them in litigation. Robinson's already there, Rip said. He's been in Cañon City for 5 days, moving men and equipment south toward the gorge. Then we move faster, McMurtry said. We move tonight. Everyone we've got, every tool, every piece of equipment. We move to the gorge, and we start building. I want grade markers established by dawn. I want work crews positioned before the sun comes up. Tom finished his coffee. Robinson's got a head start on positioning. I don't care about Robinson's positioning, McMurtry said. I care about filing a claim that shows we had active construction underway before the Atchison ever put a shovel in the ground. They left Canyon City at sunset with wagons and horses and men who looked like they understood they were marching into something that might not let them march back out. The route to the gorge followed the Arkansas River upstream, the trail growing narrower as they climbed. By the time they reached the rim above the gorge, darkness was complete except for the stars. McMurtry organized the workers into teams. 2 teams would mark the grade line, using the Denver and Rio Grande's pre-established survey marks from Rip's earlier work. 2 teams would begin rough excavation, clearing loose rock and establishing the first cuts into the canyon wall. 1 team would set up camp and prepare supply lines. Work through the night, McMurtry told them. Sleep after the sun comes up. I want visual evidence by morning that this is an active construction site. The work was chaotic in darkness. Men slipped on loose rock. Picks struck stone and threw sparks. Someone fell and broke his arm and had to be carried back up the canyon to the camp where a man with minimal medical knowledge tried to set the bone. The workers cursed and complained and kept moving, driven by McMurtry's presence and the knowledge that they were in a race where stopping meant losing. By the time light began to break across the eastern ridge, they had established survey markers in a line that descended into the gorge following the river's path. They had made 3 separate excavations, removing tons of rock and soil, creating the visible impression of ongoing construction. Equipment was scattered around the site, picks and shovels and sledges arranged to suggest coordinated work. Robinson appeared on the rim at first light with his own crew, maybe 40 men, all carrying tools and the expression of people who'd also worked through the night. He stopped when he saw what McMurtry's crews had accomplished. You're fast, Robinson said, approaching McMurtry where he stood watching his men continue working. We're motivated, McMurtry said. This won't hold up in court, Robinson said. You've been here one night. We've been surveying this route for weeks. Then see you in court, McMurtry said. Robinson looked at the grade markers and the excavation sites and the organized chaos of construction beginning. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement of being outmaneuvered. The Atchison won't back down from this, Robinson said. I didn't expect them to, McMurtry said. But they're going to have to do it while competing with our construction, not before it. Robinson turned and called to his crew. They began descending into the gorge from the north side, Robinson's workers positioning themselves in sections of the canyon that paralleled but didn't intersect with McMurtry's work. Both companies would now build simultaneously, neither able to remove the other without direct confrontation. Rip watched from the rim as the 2 crews established themselves. Within hours, there were workers on both sides of the river, both sides of certain canyon sections, all working toward the same goal through different routes. The canyon would eventually accommodate only one railroad, but for now, both companies were gambling that they could stake such a strong claim through active construction that the other would be forced to concede. By midday, the first fight broke out. 2 workers, one Denver and Rio Grande, one Atchison, clashed over access to a narrow section of canyon where water ran closest to the wall. They threw punches with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Other workers gathered around, not interfering, but watching, ready to join if the fight escalated beyond the 2 men. McMurtry didn't move. Neither did Robinson. The Denver and Rio Grande worker took a cut across his cheekbone, but landed a solid hit to the Atchison man's ribs. They separated, both breathing hard, both recognizing that continuing would bring others into the fight. This is how it's going to be, Tom said quietly, standing beside Rip. Yes, Rip said. Every day. Men fighting over inches of rock. until one side owns the whole canyon or both sides go bankrupt trying. By evening, the campfires from both companies burned on opposite sides of the gorge, the smoke rising and mixing in the deepening darkness. Workers from both sides moved through the canyon doing their work, sometimes close enough to speak to each other, sometimes pretending the other company didn't exist. McMurtry stood at the survey station, looking at his claim markers and Robinson's competing grade line. "We're building 2 railroads now," he said to Rip. "Both expensive. Both necessary. The company that gives up first loses everything. And the company that doesn't give up gets crushed by the expense," McMurtry said. "But at least they go down fighting." Chapter 8. By May, the canyon had become something like a battlefield where nobody fired bullets. The 2 companies maintained their separate camps on opposite sides of the gorge. Their workers descended into the depths each morning and emerged at dusk exhausted and angry. The construction turned into a kind of daily warfare conducted with tools and fists instead of guns. The first equipment sabotage happened on a Tuesday. Rip found the picks and shovels arranged in a neat line along the riverbank. Their handles snapped and the heads pried off. Someone from Robinson's crew had done it methodically, as if following a checklist. "How much?" Tom asked, examining the ruined tools. 20 pieces, Garrett said. He was the foreman now, managing the Denver and Rio Grande's work crew. "Maybe more. They hit us while we were eating breakfast." McMurtry stood looking at the damaged equipment without speaking. When he finally turned to the workers gathered around, his expression hadn't changed. "Buy new tools in Canyon City," he said. "Get them here by tomorrow. And organize watches. Day and night. If the Atchison comes back, I want to know about it." That evening, Rip and 4 workers rode up to Robinson's camp and scattered his supply wagon's contents across a quarter-mile of hillside. Flour and dried meat and rope and canvas all tumbled down the slope, some of it falling into the canyon. Robinson watched from a distance, but didn't interfere. He understood the exchange. His silence meant the retaliation was accepted. The fights between individual workers became more frequent and more brutal. A Denver and Rio Grande crew member named Paulson got jumped by 3 Atchison workers near the water source and came away with a cracked rib and missing teeth. 2 days later, Paulson and 5 other Rio Grande workers caught 2 Atchison men alone in a canyon section and left them both unconscious. Ellen arrived at the camp on a Wednesday with a wagon full of supplies and the expression of someone carrying bad news. Rip was working on the grade when he saw her, and he climbed up from the canyon to meet her. "Your father's supplies," Ellen said, gesturing to the wagon. "He's also sent a message." "What message?" "That both railroad companies are running through capital faster than he expected. That neither of you can sustain this pace for more than another month without additional funding." Ellen handed him a letter. "He's suggesting that one or both of you might want to negotiate rather than continue the current trajectory." Rip opened the letter. It was written in the same formal hand as the contract offer, but this one contained financial projections showing the daily cost of maintaining the dual construction sites, the cost of equipment replacement due to sabotage, the cost of medical care for injured workers. The numbers were precise and damning. "Your father calculated our expenses?" Rip asked. "My father calculates everybody's expenses," Ellen said. "He's suggesting that the Denver and Rio Grande has slightly more financial flexibility than the Atchison at the moment, but not much. Another 2 months of this, and both companies will be looking at bankruptcy." Tom appeared, climbing out of the canyon with his shirt soaked through with sweat. He saw Ellen and pulled the shirt back on, a gesture she clearly found amusing. "Miss Morrison," Tom said, "you came to join us in paradise." "I came to deliver a message," Ellen said. But I also wanted to see what my father's been describing. Rip led her to the rim overlooking the gorge. The dual construction sites were visible. Denver and Rio Grande workers on the south side, Atchison workers on the north. Both groups moving equipment and clearing rock, both trying to progress without interfering with each other's work. It was organized chaos. Two railroad companies building parallel routes that eventually had to merge into a single track. It's insane, Ellen said. It's necessary, Tom said. If we back down, Robinson takes the whole gorge. If you don't back down, you lose the company to bankruptcy, Ellen said. My father's suggesting that one of you might want to approach the other about a negotiated settlement. McMurtry will never negotiate, Rip said. Then McMurtry will lose everything, Ellen said. She was still looking at the gorge, at the two armies of workers constructing their futile parallel routes. Because the Atchison is already meeting with investors in Denver. They're raising capital specifically to outlast you. They're willing to lose money short-term to win long-term. That information hit different. Rip had assumed this was a competition of wills, but it was also a competition of resources. The Atchison, backed by Eastern money, could absorb losses that would crush a smaller company like the Denver and Rio Grande. How does your father know this? Rip asked. Because he's talked to both sides, and neither side tries to hide their strategy from suppliers, Ellen said. Your father, I mean your company needs to understand that you're not fighting Robinson anymore. You're fighting the entire Atchison financial apparatus. McMurtry received the news that evening without visible reaction. He read Ellen's letter, studied her father's financial projections, and then set the papers aside. Tell your father that the Denver and Rio Grande appreciates his advice, McMurtry said. And tell him that Palmer's already aware of the Atchison's capital raising. Tell him Palmer's doing the same thing in Boston and New York. But his voice had changed. It carried an undertone that Rip recognized as exhaustion wearing thin against determination. The daily battles and equipment sabotage were one thing. Financial warfare at the level Ellen was describing was something else entirely, something that played out in boardrooms and telegraph offices, not in canyons. Rip walked Ellen back to her wagon as the sun was setting, the canyon walls turning deep purple in the fading light. This won't end well, Ellen said. For either company. No, Rip said. It won't. My father will profit regardless, Ellen said. And men like Cobb will profit from the violence. It's men like you who lose. That's how it works, Rip said. That's how it shouldn't work, Ellen said. But it does. Chapter 9. The first fort appeared on the North Rim in early June, built by Robinson's crew over the course of 3 days. It was crude, stacked limestone blocks forming walls maybe 6 feet high, but it gave them elevation and cover. From that position, Atchison workers could see the Denver and Rio Grande's camp and most of their work sites. McMurtry's response was immediate. He ordered construction of a matching fort on the south rim, directly across from Robinson's position. The Denver and Rio Grande workers labored through the night, hauling stones and stacking them with mortar made from lime and sand. By dawn, both companies had fortifications overlooking the gorge. This is what happens when you let things get away from you, Tom said, watching from the camp as workers continued building up the walls. You start with surveyors and equipment, and eventually you've got men throwing rocks at each other from castles. They're not castles, Garrett said. They're practical positions. They're fortresses, Tom said. Call them what they are. Rip spent that day working on the grade, but his attention kept drifting to the forts rising on both sides of the canyon. They transformed the Royal Gorge from a construction site into something approaching a war zone. The symbolism was deliberate. Both companies wanted to send a message that they were willing to defend their position physically, not just legally. The first stone was thrown that afternoon. It came from Robinson's fort, a hand-sized rock that arced across the canyon and struck a Denver and Rio Grande worker named Finch on the shoulder. Finch stumbled but didn't fall. He looked up at the fort, then at McMurtry, waiting for instruction. "Keep working," McMurtry said. More stones followed as the day wore on. They came in sporadic bursts, some missing their targets completely and tumbling down the canyon wall, others connecting with workers who absorbed the blows and continued their tasks. It was harassment more than attack. The Atchison crew was testing to see how much the Rio Grande workers would tolerate. By evening, McMurtry had stockpiled rocks around the Denver and Rio Grande fort. He organized a crew to keep watch through the night and told them to respond to any thrown stones with their own barrage. "This is insane," Ellen said when she arrived the next morning with another supply wagon. She stood looking at both forts, at the stockpiles of ammunition stones arranged near their walls. "You've built fortifications over mountain passes to throw rocks." "We've built defensive positions," McMurtry corrected. The Atchison threw the first stone. "And you responded," Ellen said. "Which means now they'll throw harder. Which means you'll throw harder. Which means in a week you'll have people actually getting hurt instead of bruised." She was right. By the third day of sporadic stone throwing, a Denver and Rio Grande worker named Kowalski took a stone across the temple and went down hard. He was unconscious for 10 minutes, and when he woke, he couldn't remember his own name. Someone had to carry him up to the camp, where minimal medical attention was available. Rip sat with Kowalski while the man lay on a blanket, staring at nothing. "Do you know where you are?" Rip asked. "Royal Gorge," Kowalski said. His voice was distant, like he was speaking from underwater. "Building the railroad." "Do you know what company you work for?" Kowalski's eyes moved but didn't focus. "Denver and Rio Grande," he said. "We work for Denver and Rio Grande." The man had a concussion, and possibly worse damage that wouldn't be apparent for days or weeks. He'd have to be sent down to Canyon City on a wagon, useless to the construction efforts, another cost absorbed by the company. Another piece of evidence that this conflict was bleeding money at an unsustainable rate. That night, Rip climbed to the Denver and Rio Grande fort and found McMurtry standing watch, looking across the canyon at Robinson's position. "This isn't sustainable," Rip said. "I know," McMurtry said. "We're spending more on defending than we are on building." "I know that too. Why don't you negotiate?" McMurtry was silent for a long moment, still looking across the canyon at the distant fort. "Because negotiation means admitting that we can't win. And if we admit that here, Palmer admits it in court. And if Palmer admits it in court, the Atchison owns the gorge and everything that comes with it." "What if they own the gorge anyway?" Rip asked. "What if we're just delaying the inevitable?" "Then at least we went down fighting," McMurtry said. "At least we can tell Palmer and the shareholders that we did everything humanly possible." A stone came from Robinson's fort in the darkness, an odd-angled throw designed to travel over the canyon and strike the Rio Grande fort. It missed but came close, the whistle of it audible as it passed. McMurtry picked up a stone from the stockpile and threw it back, a calculated toss that sailed across the canyon toward Robinson's position. The stone disappeared into darkness, but the gesture was clear. The message had been received and returned. "Get some sleep," McMurtry told Rip. "Tomorrow we build and we defend." Both at the same time. Rip descended from the fort as more stones began to trade across the canyon, traveling through darkness like omens, like nothing anyone could do would stop them now. The conflict had taken on its own momentum, pulling both companies deeper into expense and contradiction. Ellen was waiting near the camp when he reached the bottom. "How bad is it?" she asked. A man took a stone to the head. He might have permanent damage. And tomorrow? Tomorrow it gets worse, Rip said. Unless somebody stops it. Nobody's going to stop it, Ellen said. Both sides are committed now. Stopping would mean losing face. She was right about that too. The stones crossing the canyon weren't really about defending the construction site anymore. They were about pride and corporate honor and the message that neither company would be pushed around. The logic was pure and destructive and unstoppable. Chapter 10. The militia arrived on a Thursday with federal authority and the kind of exhausted professionalism that comes from breaking up labor disputes for a living. Captain James Harrison rode at the front of 20 soldiers in cavalry uniforms, his face weathered from too much sun and too many similar assignments. He had the bearing of a man who'd seen actual warfare and found corporate disputes quaint by comparison. McMurtry and Robinson both came to the rim when the militia descended into the gorge. Harrison ignored them both and walked the construction sites, examining the forts and the stockpiles of throwing stones and the workers attempting to continue their tasks while soldiers moved through their workspace. When Harrison finished his inspection, he requested a meeting with both company representatives at a neutral location, the river itself, accessible from either side of the gorge. Rip accompanied McMurtry down to the meeting. Robinson came with 2 of his own men. Harrison brought 4 soldiers and a civilian who introduced himself as representing the Colorado governor's office. The throwing of rocks stops, Harrison said without preamble. Effective immediately. Anyone caught stockpiling stones for that purpose gets arrested and held until settlement of this dispute. We're defending our position, Robinson said. You're throwing rocks like children, Harrison said. His tone didn't change. It stops. And the construction? McMurtry asked. Continues, Harrison said. Both sides. Simultaneously. Under militia supervision. We'll have soldiers positioned to prevent sabotage and prevent violence. You build your routes side by side until a court decides who owns what. That's not viable, McMurtry said. 2 railroads in one narrow canyon. That's not my concern, Harrison said. Your concern is building without killing workers or throwing rocks. My concern is maintaining order while the law figures out the rest. Robinson and McMurtry exchanged a look that suggested neither was satisfied, but both understood that refusing militia authority would bring worse consequences. The governor had sent soldiers because the conflict was becoming a problem for Colorado's stability, not because either railroad company had managed to resolve it. Over the next week, the militia established a system. Soldiers positioned at regular intervals along both construction sites. Work details assigned alternating access to equipment and materials. Separate camps maintained on each side, with militia personnel between them. The effect was odd. Construction continued, but under conditions that resembled an occupied territory more than a private business enterprise. This is worse than the stones, Tom said, watching a soldier supervise Denver and Rio Grande workers carrying equipment down into the canyon. At least with the rocks we controlled when we worked. Now we're on a schedule set by the military, Garrett said. Half the day Rio Grande workers, half the day Atchison workers. We're sharing tools. It's like one company building one half of a railroad, and another company building the other half. Rip found Ellen at the supply depot, where she was negotiating with her father's freight handlers about delivery schedules. The militia's going to make this take twice as long, Rip said. The militia's going to prevent someone from getting killed, Ellen said. Which your father and Robinson should thank them for, even if neither of them sees it that way. How long can this continue? Rip asked. The militia occupation? Until a court makes a decision about prior rights, Ellen said. Until lawyers figure out whose survey was actually first. Until money runs out or somebody surrenders. She was right. The militia presence changed the nature of the conflict without ending it. The violence was suppressed, but the underlying contest remained. Both companies still needed to own the gorge, still needed to establish their claim, still needed to prove superior rights to the canyon and the route it contained. Harrison made his position clear in a meeting with McMurtry. They sat in Harrison's tent, a spare canvas structure with minimal furniture and no warmth. "I'm not here to judge who wins," Harrison said. "I'm here to make sure Colorado doesn't turn into an open war zone while you two figure it out. I have orders from the governor to maintain order and to allow both companies to work under equal conditions." "Equal conditions mean neither of us wins," McMurtry said. "Equal conditions mean both of you lose slowly instead of quickly," Harrison said. "Which is the entire point. The longer this takes, the more money both your companies spend. Eventually, financial reality will do what force can't. One of you will quit." McMurtry left the tent without responding. But the assessment was accurate. The militia presence wasn't protecting either company. It was neutralizing both of them, turning the conflict into a war of attrition where the strongest financial resources would eventually prevail. That evening, McMurtry sent a telegram to General Palmer in Denver. Rip watched him write it out. "Militia intervention ongoing. Construction proceeding under equal conditions. Atchison likely to outlast U.S. financially, unless additional capital secured. Estimate 3 months before one side surrenders." The reply came back the next morning. "Secure capital through Boston investors. Palmer personally guaranteeing expansion. Hold position. Victory or bankruptcy, no middle ground." Tom read the message over Rip's shoulder. "Palmer's betting everything." "Palmer's already bet everything," Rip said. "This just makes it official." That night, Rip climbed to the rim with Ellen and looked down at both construction sites operating under militia supervision. Soldiers stood at regular intervals. Workers from both companies moved through the canyon according to schedule, building their competing routes, neither one able to force the other out. "Your father was right," Rip said. "Both companies will lose." "One will lose more than the other," Ellen said. "And one will survive the loss while the other doesn't. That's how these things resolve, not through victory but through differential damage." Below them, the Arkansas River moved through the canyon like it had moved for 1,000 years, indifferent to railroads and militias and the ambitions of men trying to tame it. The canyon would have its railroad eventually. The question was only which company would pay the price to put it there. Chapter 11. Bat Masterson arrived in Cañon City on the morning of March 1879 with 2 assistants and the kind of reputation that made men stop talking when he entered a room. He was a thin man with a dark mustache and eyes that had seen more gunfights than most men saw sunsets. He'd been a lawman in Dodge City before turning professional, which meant he knew both sides of the border between law and necessary violence. McMurtry heard about it from a telegraph operator who'd sent messages to the Atchison offices in Denver. Masterson had been hired by the AT&SF to assemble an armed force, not soldiers but gunfighters, men willing to work for money and capable of creating the kind of problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation. "How many?" Tom asked when McMurtry told them. "Nobody knows yet. But the operator said Robinson's been sending telegrams requesting men." Said Robinson named specific people. Rip understood immediately what had changed. The militia presence had forced both companies into a stalemate where construction continued, but neither side could dominate the other. The Atchison had decided that if you couldn't win through superior engineering or financial pressure, You won through superior firepower. They were bringing in the professionals. By the end of the week, the gunfighters started arriving. They came in small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, riding into Cañon City with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they'd been hired many times before and saw nothing unusual about working for railroad companies. Rip recognized some of the names when he heard them mentioned in saloons. Doc Holliday, who'd been involved in the Tombstone conflicts, and Ben Thompson, who'd killed men in Texas and lived to tell about it. There was Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, who'd stolen from banks and trains and wore his reputation like other men wore hats. Mysterious Dave Mather, whose background nobody seemed clear on, but whose competence with firearms was indisputable. John Joshua Webb, another gunfighter with a history of violence stretching across multiple territories. 70 of them, Ellen said when she arrived with supplies. My father heard from Atchison suppliers. Masterson's assembled 70 gunfighters. McMurtry didn't react visibly, but something shifted in his posture. 70 men trained in violence represented a force that militia presence couldn't neutralize without orders from Denver. Harrison's soldiers were peacekeepers, not warriors. If Masterson's army decided to take the gorge through force, the militia would have to call for reinforcements or withdraw. What's Palmer doing? Tom asked. What can he do? McMurtry said. He doesn't have time to hire his own army. By the time we assembled equivalent firepower, the Atchison would own the gorge and the legal precedent. Rip walked down to one of the saloons and found Masterson sitting at a back table with 2 of his men. The gunfighter looked exactly like his reputation suggested. Calm, dangerous, the kind of man who'd calculated odds in too many confrontations to be troubled by them anymore. Rip sat down without being invited. You work for the Rio Grande, Masterson said. Not a question. I do. Then you know the situation's about to change. Masterson gestured to one of his men, who left the table. The Atchison hired me to ensure their interests are protected in the gorge. Ensure means whatever's necessary to achieve that outcome. Including killing workers? Rip asked. Including that, Masterson said. Though we prefer not to when alternatives exist. Dead workers bring militia reinforcements. Intimidated workers just stop showing up. And if the Rio Grande hires their own gunfighters, then you've got a gunfighter war instead of a construction race, Masterson said. Which the Atchison will win, because they've got more capital and more patience. And because I'm better at hiring competent killers than your company is at hiring them. Rip left the saloon and rode directly to the gorge where McMurtry was overseeing the construction schedule. He found him at the rim, looking down at workers moving through the canyon under militia supervision. Masterson won't start anything directly, Rip said. But he'll work around the militia. He'll intimidate workers until they quit. He'll make the gorge too dangerous for anyone who doesn't want to die for a railroad. I know, McMurtry said. What do we do? McMurtry turned to face him. We find out if Palmer has any contacts who can assemble countering force. The message went to Denver that afternoon. By evening, a response came back indicating that Palmer was making inquiries but couldn't promise anything. Hiring 70 gunfighters wasn't something you accomplished in days. It took networks and trust and connections that took months to build. Ellen found Rip at the camp that evening. My father wants to increase his prices, she said. He knows both companies are about to enter financial crisis, and he's positioning to profit from it. Your father's a vulture, Rip said. My father's a businessman, Ellen said. Which is another word for the same thing in Colorado. But that's not why I came to tell you. I came to tell you that Masterson's men are already moving through the work camps, talking to Rio Grande workers, making it clear that the next few weeks are going to be dangerous. How dangerous? Dangerous enough that smart men look for other work, Ellen said. Dangerous enough that you'll spend your time recruiting workers instead of building railroad. Dangerous enough that the Atchison wins without firing a shot. Rip walked with her to where her wagon was hitched. The sun was setting, turning the canyon walls orange and gold, the river running silver below. This is what happens when corporations decide violence is cheaper than negotiation, Ellen said. They're right, by the way. Violence is cheaper. It's also more final. So we hire our own gunfighters? Rip asked. You try, Ellen said. But you'll be 3 weeks behind the Atchison. 3 weeks is enough time for Masterson to establish control of the situation. 3 weeks is enough time for your workers to decide the money isn't worth dying for. She drove away in her wagon as darkness settled over Canyon City. Above the gorge, the first stars appeared, and in the saloons and hotels, Masterson's men drank and planned and waited for orders that would turn the Royal Gorge from a construction site into something that resembled an armed camp. Chapter 12. Rip spent 3 days watching the gunfighters work. Not at killing, they hadn't started that yet, but at the business of intimidation, which required precision and understanding of human nature. They positioned themselves strategically around the gorge, visible but not threatening, present but not directly violent. They talked to Rio Grande workers in low voices, making clear what could happen to a man who continued working for a company that was about to lose. Doc Holliday sat outside the Rio Grande camp one morning, cleaning his pistol with methodical care. He was thinner than Rip expected, with the look of a man whose body was being consumed from the inside. Consumption, probably. But his hands were steady, and his eyes tracked every movement in the camp. "You're the surveyor," Holliday said when Rip approached. "I am." "You're good at it, from what I hear." Holliday didn't look up from his pistol. "Palmer's lucky to have you." "Not that luck matters much anymore." "Why's that?" Rip asked. "Because you've got Masterson now," Holliday said. "And Masterson doesn't lose fights he's been paid to win." Ben Thompson was different, louder, more aggressive, the kind of man who seemed to enjoy violence as entertainment rather than business. He rode through the construction sites deliberately, his presence meant to be noticed. He spoke to McMurtry directly at one point, pulling him aside with the kind of presumption that suggested he no longer viewed the Rio Grande as worthy of formal respect. "Your men are scared," Thompson said, loud enough for others to hear. "Smart ones will leave. The others will get hurt. Masterson's giving you a week to realize it's over." "Tell Masterson the Rio Grande doesn't quit," McMurtry said. "Masterson knows you don't quit," Thompson said. "That's why he's not asking. He's telling." By the end of the week, 12 Rio Grande workers had walked away. They took their tools and their experience and their labor elsewhere, finding work in Denver or other mining operations where they weren't likely to get shot. The loss was manageable in numbers but symbolic in meaning. Word was spreading that the Atchison was willing to back their claim with lethal force, and the Rio Grande wasn't. McMurtry received a message that Palmer was attempting to assemble his own force of gunfighters, but the effort was moving slowly. Palmer had fewer connections in the underworld of professional violence. He was a businessman, not a criminal, and that distinction mattered when you needed to hire men willing to kill. 2 weeks, Ellen said when she delivered supplies. "That's how long my father estimates the Rio Grande has before workers abandon the site in large numbers." "Your father's timing seems specific," Rip said. "My father's hired men like these before," Ellen said. "He knows how long it takes for intimidation to work. He knows that most men will tolerate uncertainty for a while, but once they realize the threat is serious and ongoing, they leave." Rip found Masterson at the Copper Dollar Saloon, sitting at the same table where he'd met the gunfighter days earlier. This time, Masterson invited him to sit. "Your company's finished," Masterson said without preamble. "Palmer's good at business, but he's not good at war. War requires different thinking." "Palmer's hiring his own men," Rip said. "Palmer will hire men too slow and too inexperienced," Masterson said. "I've got Doc Holliday and Ben Thompson and men who've killed in Kansas and Texas and California. Palmer will get railroad workers who learn to shoot in the militia and think that makes them dangerous." Masterson sipped whiskey. "It doesn't. Killing is a profession. Most men aren't professionals." "What happens now?" Rip asked. "Now my men make work at the gorge impossible," Masterson said. "They don't need to kill anyone. They just need to be present and capable. They need to make it clear that the next Rio Grande worker who descends into that canyon might not come back out. Once enough workers believe that, the construction stops." "And the militia?" "Won't interfere with my men as long as my men don't actually commit murder," Masterson said. "Harrison's not interested in fighting Atchison-hired gunfighters. His job is maintaining order, and order means the absence of bodies. As long as my men are just present and intimidating, there's no bodies." Masterson set down his glass. "You should leave Canyon City. You should tell Palmer this is over. You should find another job with a company that's going to survive." "I'm not leaving," Rip said. "Then you're a fool," Masterson said. "Foolishness gets men killed. I respect your loyalty, but I won't let it stop me from doing the job I was hired for." Rip left the saloon and found Tom at the supply depot. Tom looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were shaking slightly as he checked inventory lists. "7 more left today," Tom said. "Workers." Just walked away. "Masterson doesn't need to kill anyone," Rip said. "He just needs to be there. The threat is enough." "How do we fight that?" Tom asked. "I don't know," Rip said. "We find Palmer's gunfighters before they arrive. We find a way to show our workers that the Rio Grande isn't giving up. We find something that makes staying worth the risk." They stood in silence, watching Ellen's freight handlers unload supplies that would probably never be used if the workers abandoned the site in large enough numbers. "This is how wars are really won," Ellen said from behind them. Both men turned. "Not through gunfights or courage. Through making one side believe continuation isn't worth the cost. My father would approve of Masterson's strategy. It's economical. It's brutal without being bloody. It's exactly how business should be conducted, if business is conducted honestly." "That's not honest," Tom said. "No," Ellen said. "But it is efficient. And in Colorado, efficiency matters more than honor." Chapter 13. The supply train was hit on a Tuesday evening when the light was turning orange and the road narrow. Rip was in Canyon City when it happened, but he heard about it from a freight handler who'd seen the wreckage: 3 wagons overturned, supplies scattered across a mile of mountainside, the horses dead or scattered beyond recovery. Tom had been leading the supply run. Rip found him at the doctor's office with bandages around his ribs and a gash across his shoulder that had required 10 stitches. His face was singed from heat, and his hair was burned on one side. "Dynamite," Tom said. His voice was rough from smoke inhalation. "They used dynamite to blow the wagon apart. I was checking the cargo when it happened. The concussion threw me clear, but it killed Patterson and Henderson." Both of them." "Both of them," Tom said. "And the horses. Everything on those wagons just gone. Scattered across the mountainside." Rip sat on the edge of the bed. 2 men were dead. The supplies that had been destined for the gorge workers were now debris. The message was clear. Masterson had moved beyond intimidation into direct sabotage. The gloves, as the phrase went, were off. "Who did it?" Rip asked. "I didn't see," Tom said. "But there were men in the rocks above the road. I heard them laughing after the blast. They thought it was funny." McMurtry's response came within hours. He called the remaining Rio Grande workers together and told them straight, wages were being doubled for any man willing to continue working. Those willing to leave would be paid for the time they'd already worked and given references to find other employment. Those willing to stay would be armed and positioned to watch for sabotage. "This is escalation," Ellen said when Rip told her. She was at her father's freight office, preparing to deliver another load of supplies that might now be targeted. Masterson moved from intimidation to violence. "That means the Atchison is desperate." "Desperate why?" Rip asked. "They're winning. Workers are leaving. The Rio Grande's position is deteriorating daily." "But it's not deteriorating fast enough," Ellen said. "Palmer must have wired money, because some of your workers are still showing up. Some new ones are arriving. And that means the Rio Grande hasn't surrendered yet, which means Masterson needs to accelerate the process." "By blowing up supply trains?" "By making it clear that the Atchison will use any tool available," Ellen said. "Including explosives. Including killing workers. Including destroying equipment. Masterson's message is that the Rio Grande can either leave now or lose everything." The second sabotage came 2 days later. This time it was the construction equipment, picks, shovels, sledges, all stacked near the gorge rim. Someone lit fuses to dynamite charges positioned beneath the piles, and the entire stockpile was scattered down the canyon. The loss was significant. Replacement equipment would take weeks to order and deliver from Denver. Captain Harrison called for Masterson. The meeting happened at the militia camp, with Harrison, Masterson, McMurtry, and Robinson all present. Rip wasn't there, but word came back that Harrison had given Masterson an ultimatum. Any more dynamite, and Harrison would have him arrested regardless of who had hired him. "I'm not the saboteur," Masterson had said. "But I can't control who does what in the region. There are many people interested in seeing the Rio Grande fail. Maybe it was Atchison workers. Maybe it was locals. Maybe it was Rio Grande workers trying to frame the Atchison." Harrison arrested 3 men suspected of involvement in the sabotage. None of them connected to Masterson, all of them positioned so that blame could be distributed. The message was that Harrison was attempting to maintain order while preserving ambiguity about who was actually responsible. McMurtry called Rip to his tent that evening. "Palmer's responding," McMurtry said. He showed Rip a telegram that had arrived from Denver. "Send list of available gunfighters. Will authorize contracts for defensive force. Victory requires matching Atchison commitment." "Palmer's going to hire his own army," Rip said. "Palmer doesn't have a choice," McMurtry said. "The Atchison's shown they're willing to use dynamite and kill workers and destroy equipment. If we don't respond with equivalent force, we lose not just the gorge, but worker morale and the legal standing that comes from being the aggrieved party." "You want me to find gunfighters," Rip said. "I want you to go to Denver and work with Palmer's people to identify men who can assemble a force," McMurtry said. "I want you to find men who understand that they're defending workers, not attacking them. I want you to find men who can make the Atchison understand that the Rio Grande will fight." Rip left for Denver the next morning. The ride took 2 days, and he spent the time thinking about the conversation with Masterson in the saloon, the gunfighter's observation that war required different thinking than business. Masterson was right. The Rio Grande was no longer operating in the realm of business. It was operating in the realm of warfare, where rules were different and consequences were measured in blood. By the time Rip reached Denver, he understood that Palmer had already committed to the path forward. The Railroad War had stopped being about surveying routes and started being about hiring men to kill other men. The Royal Gorge would eventually get its railroad, but the price would include deaths and violence and the transformation of the Colorado mountains into a battleground. Ellen was wrong about one thing, Rip thought as his horse climbed the streets toward Palmer's offices. It wasn't efficient. It was wasteful and destructive, and it served nobody except the men like Masterson who profited from violence. But it was happening nonetheless, and the only question left was how many bodies would pile up before someone declared a winner. Chapter 14. Ellen's father arranged the dinner on a Friday with the kind of deliberate planning that suggested he'd been thinking about it for weeks. The setting was the best restaurant in Denver, the kind of place where the silverware mattered more than the food. Across from Ellen sat Marcus Whitmore, an Atchison investor from Philadelphia who'd come west to examine the company's Colorado operations. Ellen wore a dress her mother had sent from back east, dark blue with ivory lacing. She looked like something constructed rather than grown, and she hated every moment of the evening. "Your father speaks highly of your business acumen," Whitmore said. He was a man in his 40s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd never been denied anything he wanted. Unusual for a woman, but not unwelcome in Colorado. "My father knows I'm useful," Ellen said. "Your father knows you'd be even more useful with proper connections," Whitmore said. "The Atchison values families who understand the importance of alignment. Strategic alignment." Ellen knew what alignment meant. It meant her father had negotiated with Whitmore to arrange a marriage that would bind the Morrison freight business to Atchison interests. It meant her future was being purchased the way her father purchased railroad ties, as a commodity with a price attached. "My father didn't mention this," Ellen said. "Your father's being tactful," Whitmore said. "But I'm being direct. The Atchison would benefit from your family's supply network. Your family would benefit from Atchison patronage. I'm prepared to offer marriage on terms your father finds acceptable, and that would provide you considerable security." Ellen set down her fork. Around them, other diners conducted their own business deals, their own negotiations. Denver in 1879 was a city where everything had a price, and everyone understood the economy of personal advancement. "I need to speak with my father," Ellen said. She found him at the freight office after the dinner ended. He was reviewing ledgers, marking items with a pencil, conducting the kind of detailed work that suggested the business required constant attention. "Whitmore explained his proposal," Ellen said. "He did. Her father didn't look up from the ledger. And he's offering terms that would secure our position with the Atchison for years. Probably decades. By marrying me to a man I've never met from a city I've never visited. By securing business arrangements that benefit us," her father said. He finally looked up. "Ellen, you're 26 years old. Most women your age are married with children. You've avoided that situation through work and by being useful to my operations. But utility doesn't provide security. Marriage to Whitmore provides security. Marriage to Whitmore provides access to Atchison capital," Ellen said. "For you. Not for me." Her father set down his pencil. "That's the difference between us," he said. "You think there's a separation between your interests and the business. There isn't. The business is the family. The family is the business. When I advance the business, I advance you. By selling me to an investor. By connecting you to a man of considerable resources," her father said. "By ensuring that regardless of which railroad wins this war, you're positioned to benefit. Whitmore will make you comfortable. He'll give you children. He'll provide stability. Ellen walked to the window that overlooked Denver's streets. Down below, men moved through the evening conducting their business, pursuing their interests, building their fortunes. She thought about Rip Campbell in the mountains, working for a company that was probably going to lose, committed to surveying routes that might never carry trains. "I need time," Ellen said. "You have a week," her father said. "Whitmore leaves for Philadelphia at the end of the week. If you want security, you accept his proposal before he departs." Ellen didn't go back to the gorge immediately. She spent 2 days in Denver making arrangements, visiting her mother at the family house, walking through parks, and trying to think through a problem that didn't have a solution. Either she accepted Whitmore's proposal and secured her family's financial future, or she rejected it and faced whatever came next. Marriage to someone from her own class with her own limited resources, or remaining unmarried and managing her father's business until he died, or she reached an age where marriage became impossible. She found Rip at Palmer's offices, where he was working with the Denver and Rio Grande's people to identify and hire defensive force. They met on the street outside, and Rip looked like he'd aged years in the weeks since she'd last seen him. "I'm getting married," Ellen said, "to an Atchison investor. My father negotiated the arrangement." Rip didn't respond immediately. Around them, the city continued its business. Wagons moved, horses carried riders, the normal commerce of a growing city. "Do you want to marry him?" Rip asked. "No," Ellen said, "but I want my family secure. I want to not spend the rest of my life worried about money. Security through marriage to a man you don't know. Security through practical arrangement," Ellen said, "which is how most marriages work. Love is something poor people can afford because it doesn't require resources. Rich people arrange marriages the way they arrange business deals." "I thought you were different," Rip said. "I am different," Ellen said. "That's why I'm here telling you instead of just disappearing. That's why I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me I'm wrong to do this. That's why I'm standing in the street like an idiot, hoping you'll say something that makes the decision easier." Rip looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Palmer's offices occupied an entire building. Inside, Denver and Rio Grande people were assembling the resources to fight the Atchison. Outside, Ellen stood preparing to marry into the opposition. "I can't give you security," Rip said. "I don't know if the Rio Grande will survive this war. I don't know what I'll have to offer anyone when this is over." "I know," Ellen said. "That's why I have to do this." She walked away from him and toward the hotel where Whitmore was staying. Behind her, Rip didn't follow. He went back into Palmer's offices to continue the work of assembling an army, leaving Ellen to make her arrangements with a man from Philadelphia who understood the value of marrying well, but wouldn't understand anything else about her. Ellen accepted Whitmore's proposal that evening. The wedding would happen in 3 weeks, which meant it would occur while the Railroad War was still being fought. She would become Mrs. Marcus Whitmore and move east and spend the rest of her life understanding that security came at the price of every choice that mattered. Chapter 15. The Pueblo Roundhouse sat on the southern edge of town like a fortress designed by men who understood railroads, but not military architecture. It was brick and iron, 3 stories where it mattered, with loading docks and repair bays, and enough space inside to service locomotives and store equipment. On June 11, 1879, it became the Atchison's command center and the Denver and Rio Grande's target. Rip arrived with Palmer's newly hired gunfighters, 40 men who'd been assembled through contacts in Kansas and Colorado, most of them former lawmen or soldiers or simply men who'd learned to handle weapons in contexts where hesitation got you killed. They positioned themselves around the roundhouse in a loose perimeter, not attacking, but making clear that the structure was surrounded. Inside, Masterson had maybe 30 men plus the Atchison railway staff, who'd barricaded themselves when they realized the Rio Grande was making a move. The standoff began at dawn, with neither side willing to initiate direct confrontation. Palmer was positioning this as a legal action, Rio Grande forces enforcing court orders to seize Atchison assets. Masterson understood that open gunfire would complicate legal defenses and draw militia intervention. "We've got time," Palmer said to Rip as they observed from a position north of the roundhouse. Palmer was a military man from his younger years, and he conducted this siege with that background informing his strategy. Masterson's trapped. He can stay inside until his supplies run out or he surrenders. He can't escape without exposing his men to our fire. He could start killing hostages, one of the Rio Grande officers said. "There are no hostages," Palmer said. "Just Atchison employees who chose to stay with their company. That's not a hostage situation, that's a siege." By afternoon, Masterson attempted negotiation. He sent a messenger under a white cloth to speak with Palmer. The messenger was a thin man with a scarred face, one of Masterson's inner circle. "Masterson says you've got no legal authority to hold the roundhouse," the messenger said. "Says the court order is still being appealed. Says you're committing theft of company property." "The court order stands," Palmer said. "Masterson has until sunset to vacate the building. After that, Rio Grande forces will take possession." "What about the men inside?" "What about them?" Palmer asked. "They'll be arrested? Charged?" "Only if they resist," Palmer said. "Otherwise, they can walk out with their hands visible, and we'll treat them as employees, not combatants." The messenger returned to the roundhouse. Minutes later, a cannon appeared on the roof. It was an old field piece, probably Mexican surplus or equipment captured during the Civil War. How Masterson had managed to position it on the roundhouse roof wasn't immediately clear, but there it was, proof that the gunfighter understood siege warfare better than Palmer had anticipated. "That changes things," Palmer said quietly. The cannon fired at 4 o'clock. The shot went high and struck the brick building where Rio Grande men were positioned, creating a shower of fragments but hitting no one. The message was clear. Masterson had brought artillery to the problem, which meant the Rio Grande couldn't simply wait for supplies to run out. Rip watched Palmer's face as the general calculated new options. Attack directly and risk casualties from the cannon. Maintain the siege and wait for the cannon to jam or ammunition to run out. Negotiate with Masterson on terms that might let both sides claim partial victory. Send in an assault force, Palmer decided. Center the attack on the loading dock. Concentrate fire on the cannon position to suppress it. We take the roundhouse before sunset, or we take it after sunset. We take it. The assault came at dusk. Rio Grande gunfighters moved toward the loading dock in a coordinated line. Their return fire focused on the roof position where the cannon crew operated. Inside the roundhouse, Atchison men fired from windows and doors, creating a crossfire that killed 2 Rio Grande workers in the first seconds. Rip found himself moving toward the dock with rifles pointed everywhere. The noise was overwhelming. Gunfire, shouted orders, the boom of the cannon firing again and missing. Inside the roundhouse, men appeared at windows and fired before disappearing back into shelter. The loading dock was defended by 3 Atchison workers and one of Masterson's gunfighters. When the Rio Grande assault reached the dock level, the gunfighter stepped into view with a pistol in each hand and fired before anyone could react. 2 Rio Grande men fell. The third one tackled the Atchison gunfighter, and they both went down in a tangle of bodies and violence that ended when a Rio Grande knife found its target. Rip and 4 others forced open the loading dock door. Inside, the roundhouse opened into cavernous space. Repair bays with locomotives in various states of maintenance, tools scattered across the floor, the smell of oil and metal and fear. Masterson appeared at a railing on the second level with Doc Holliday beside him. Both men had pistols, but neither fired immediately. "It's over," Palmer called from outside. "Your men are surrounded. Your ammunition won't last the night. You can walk out with your hands visible, and no one dies." Masterson looked at Holliday, then down at the Rio Grande men who'd entered the roundhouse. He holstered his pistol and turned toward the stairs that descended into the main bay. "Tell your men to stand down," Masterson said to his crew inside the roundhouse. "We're leaving." The Atchison men emerged slowly, hands visible, weapons on the floor. Masterson and his gunfighters came last, moving with the controlled dignity of men who'd fought and lost but hadn't been broken. Doc Holliday looked like walking was difficult, but his expression didn't change as he descended into the bay where Rio Grande workers watched with weapons ready. By sunset, the roundhouse belonged to the Denver and Rio Grande. Rip stood in the main bay as Palmer moved through the space, examining the locomotives and equipment, calculating the value of what his company had just seized. Outside, militia had arrived to formalize the transition and prevent any attempt by Atchison personnel to reclaim the property. "Masterson's going to disappear," one of the Rio Grande officers said to Rip. "That kind of defeat, he won't stay in Colorado." "He might not," Rip said. "But the Atchison will find someone else to replace him. This victory doesn't end anything." "It's still a victory," the officer said. Rip looked at the roundhouse and the seized equipment, and the Rio Grande workers moving through the space claiming ownership. It was a victory on paper. But the real conflict, the one about who would control the Royal Gorge and the routes to Leadville, that was still unresolved. The battle in Pueblo had determined nothing about the larger war. Chapter 16. The Atchison brought another cannon to Pueblo. This one was larger, positioned on a flat car near the rail yards where it could command approaches to the seized roundhouse. Masterson had retreated, but left behind experienced men under the command of a Texan named Sutton, who understood artillery and refused to concede without leverage. Palmer received the intelligence that evening from scouts who'd been monitoring Atchison movements. The new cannon changed the tactical situation entirely. One cannon on the roundhouse roof had been suppressed through coordinated assault. 2 cannons, one on the Rio Grande side and one positioned to provide covering fire, created a stalemate that no amount of infantry assault could break. "We need our own artillery," Palmer said to Rip and the other officers gathered in the commandeered railroad office. Maps covered the table showing positions, supply lines, ammunition depots. "This becomes a siege with heavy weapons. Whoever has more cannon wins." "There's artillery in Denver at the Territorial Armory," one officer said. "But it'll take 2 days to transport it here." "Then we're defending with rifles for 2 days," Palmer said. The Atchison cannon fired its first shot at dawn on the second day. It targeted the roundhouse, a test shot that struck brick and collapsed part of the eastern wall. The message was clear. The Atchison intended to reduce the building rather than allow Rio Grande occupation to consolidate. Rip was inside the roundhouse when the shot hit. The impact threw him against a support pillar, knocked the breath from his lungs. Around him, men shouted and moved toward the damaged section, assessing injury and destruction. No one killed in that first shot, but the damage was significant enough that sustained bombardment would become untenable. Palmer moved the Rio Grande workforce out of the roundhouse. They established positions in the rail yards and depot buildings, creating a distributed defense rather than concentrating in the one structure Sutton could target. It was a more defensible arrangement, but acknowledged that they'd lost control of the actual roundhouse. The Atchison cannon fired every 2 hours, each shot targeting a different part of the roundhouse, systematically destroying the building the Rio Grande had fought so hard to capture. By noon, the roof had partially collapsed. By afternoon, the eastern wall was breached. By evening, the roundhouse was becoming rubble. "This is Sutton's way of saying he's not done fighting," Tom said. He'd recovered enough from his supply train injuries to rejoin the operation, though his movements were still careful. "He's destroying what he can't hold." "He's destroying what we can't occupy," Palmer corrected. "The building itself doesn't matter. The equipment inside matters. The position matters. But the building, that's just structure." A Rio Grande officer brought news that the Territorial Armory had released 2 pieces of field artillery to Palmer's command. They arrived in Pueblo by rail that evening, wheeled into position north of the Atchison cannon. The next morning, when Sutton fired his next shot at the roundhouse, the Rio Grande cannon responded by firing at the Atchison position. The impact was direct. The Atchison cannon exploded in a shower of metal fragments. Several Atchison workers near the weapon fell. Sutton's advantage evaporated in an instant. But Sutton wasn't defeated. He brought in 3 more cannons over the next 2 days. They appeared on different rail spurs, different positions, creating a distributed artillery force that the Rio Grande couldn't suppress with one cannon. The siege transformed into an artillery duel, where both sides maneuvered equipment and fired at distant targets, trying to control territory through superior firepower. Rip found himself coordinating ammunition supply and coordinating with the Rio Grande artillery crews. It was work that resembled actual warfare more than railroad work, calculating trajectories, measuring distances, positioning weapons to control movement. On the 4th day of the artillery exchange, a shell from an Atchison cannon struck the Rio Grande position directly. 2 workers died instantly. 3 others were wounded badly enough that they couldn't continue working. The casualty toll was mounting in ways that had nothing to do with gunfights or personal courage, and everything to do with calculated destruction. Palmer received a message from Denver. The military governor was threatening to send federal troops to impose martial law if the Pueblo siege continued for more than 3 additional days. The territorial militia was already stretched thin. Federal intervention would mean both railroad companies would be operating under military authority rather than legal authority. "Sutton's betting that federal intervention will stop us," Palmer said to Rip. "That we'll pull back rather than fight the U.S. Army." "Will we?" "We'll negotiate," Palmer said. "Because a negotiation under federal authority looks different than a negotiation under Colorado authority. The federal government doesn't care about railroad precedent. The federal government cares about order." Palmer sent an emissary to Sutton under flag of truce. The negotiation lasted 3 hours. When the emissary returned, he carried Sutton's terms. The Atchison would cease artillery fire. The Rio Grande would allow Atchison personnel to collect tools and portable equipment from the roundhouse ruins. Both companies would withdraw their armed forces from Pueblo and submit the property dispute to federal arbitration. "He's conceding the roundhouse," Palmer said. "But he's preserving Atchison assets and avoiding the humiliation of federal occupation." The artillery fell silent that afternoon. Over the next 2 days, Atchison workers moved through the roundhouse wreckage collecting what could be salvaged. Rio Grande workers dismantled equipment and transported it to secure locations. By the time federal troops arrived in Pueblo, The siege had ended without direct confrontation between railroad forces and the military. Rip stood watching the last Atchison workers load equipment onto rail cars. The Pueblo siege had cost lives on both sides, destroyed valuable property, and in the end resolved nothing about the fundamental question: who would control the Royal Gorge? "What now?" Tom asked. "Now we go back to the gorge," Rip said, "because that's where the real war is still being fought." Chapter 17. The courtroom in Denver was formal, in the way that suggested the law took itself seriously, even when the law was being bent. Judge Harmon sat elevated above everyone else, his robes making him look like something historical rather than human. Below him, lawyers from both railroad companies positioned themselves at tables covered in documents, surveys, claim filings, correspondence spanning years. Rip sat in the gallery watching men use language as a weapon. It was different from artillery or gunfights. It was slower and more precise, and it relied on the judge believing one version of events rather than another. The Denver and Rio Grande's lawyer was a man named Ashcroft, who'd been practicing law since before Colorado was a state. He stood and placed survey documents on the judge's bench, old papers from 1872 showing Denver and Rio Grande surveyors mapping the Royal Gorge route. "Your Honor," Ashcroft said, "the Denver and Rio Grande conducted preliminary surveys of the gorge route in 1872. These documents establish prior intention to develop this passage. Subsequent abandonment does not negate original claim. The Atchison arrival and grading were acts of trespass on property the Rio Grande had already established interest in." The Atchison lawyer was younger, sharper, with the kind of courtroom manner that suggested he'd been trained in Eastern legal schools and believed law was a game to be won through superior argument. His name was Cordwell, and he stood to counter Ashcroft's position. "The 1872 surveys were exploratory," Cordwell said. "The Denver and Rio Grande filed no official claim. They conducted no active development. They made no financial commitment to the route. They abandoned it. Abandonment extinguishes prior interest. The Atchison's grading began in good faith belief that the route was available for development. Back and forth they went for 3 days. Documents were presented. Testimony was given from surveyors and engineers. A Atchison witness testified that Robinson hadn't known about the 1872 surveys. A Rio Grande witness testified that local knowledge of those surveys was widespread in surveying circles. Rip watched Judge Harmon take notes, his expression remaining neutral, his rulings on procedural matters showing no preference for either side. The judge was playing the part of impartial arbiter, but everyone in the courtroom understood that he would eventually have to pick a winner. Judges didn't sit in the middle. They sat on one side or the other eventually. On the third day, Ashcroft presented testimony from General Palmer himself. Palmer walked to the witness stand with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. He was sworn in and positioned to describe the Rio Grande's intentions regarding the gorge. "We surveyed the route in 1872, Palmer testified. "We intended to develop it. We had financial constraints that prevented immediate construction. We maintained our interest through ongoing surveying and planning. The Atchison's arrival was unexpected and aggressive." Cordwell cross-examined Palmer with the kind of precision that suggested he'd prepared meticulously for this moment. "General Palmer," Cordwell said, "between 1872 and 1878, when the Atchison arrived, did the Rio Grande conduct any public filings regarding the gorge route?" "We filed claim documents," Palmer said. "Where?" "Through our surveying operations." "Through your surveyors," Cordwell said. "Not through official county recording offices. Not through state land commission filings. Not through any public mechanism that would notify other parties that you held interest in the route. Palmer's expression tightened. He understood where Cordwell was going. We believed our surveys established sufficient claim, Palmer said. Believing and proving are different matters, Cordwell said. Your Honor, we have no evidence that the Denver and Rio Grande filed any official claim to the Gorge route between 1872 and 1878. No county filing. No state filing. No public notice of any kind. By law, an unclaimed route is available for development by any interested party. Judge Harmon called for recess. Rip found Tom outside the courtroom in the hallway. Palmer got beaten, Tom said. Cordwell made it clear the Rio Grande never formally claimed the gorge. They surveyed it, but didn't protect it legally. The judge hasn't ruled, Rip said. The judge doesn't need to rule, Tom said. Cordwell already made the ruling. The law is what lawyers argue it is, and Cordwell argued better than Ashcroft. Rip went to find Ellen. She was staying at a hotel near the courthouse, preparing for her wedding, which was scheduled to occur in 2 weeks. She received him in the lobby, dressed in traveling clothes, clearly about to leave Denver. The case is lost, Ellen said when Rip told her about Cordwell's cross-examination. My father told me yesterday that Cordwell was making calls to establish precedent. He was confident the Atchison would win. Your father's betting on the Atchison, Rip said. My father's betting on whoever he's married me to, Ellen said. Which means my father is betting on the Atchison. Which means my father knows something about the legal outcome that you don't. She was right. 3 days later, Judge Harmon issued his ruling. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway held valid prior rights to the Royal Gorge route, based on Robinson's surveying and active development beginning in April 1878. The Denver and Rio Grande's 1872 surveys did not constitute formal claim under Colorado statute. The Atchison's grading operations would continue without interference from Rio Grande personnel. Palmer received the decision in Denver and sent a telegram to Rip in Cañon City, appeal being filed. Do not abandon gorge operations. Legal battle continues. But everyone understood what the ruling meant. The Atchison had won in court. The Rio Grande would appeal and probably lose again. Somewhere in this courtroom, Judge Harmon had decided that corporate law favored the company with better lawyers and better positioning. Rip rode back to the gorge to tell McMurtry the news. What he would do with the news remained unclear. The Rio Grande could abandon the gorge route and look elsewhere. Or it could continue fighting with knowledge that the law was against them. Either way, the business of surveying and building railroad would continue, just on different terms and with less hope of eventual victory. Chapter 18. So the law is a whore. Tom Bradley's voice was a low, bitter rumble in the quiet of the Cañon City surveyor's office. He threw the telegram from Palmer onto the map-covered table. It lay there, a small white flag of defiance in a war that had just been lost on paper. Appeal being filed. Do not abandon gorge operations. Rip stood at the window, looking out at the dusty street. The town was moving on, wagons and riders passing, business being done. The court's decision in Denver hadn't changed the price of flour or the taste of whiskey. It had only changed the future for the men in this room. The law is a tool, Rip said, not turning. Cordwell just knew how to use it better than we did. He had a better judge, Tom grumbled. He walked to the window and stood beside Rip. So what now? We keep building a railroad the law says we can't have. We keep putting our heads down while the Atchison throws rocks and dynamite at us with a judge's blessing. We follow orders, Rip said. Palmer's not quitting. Palmer's not the one sleeping in a tent with Masterson's gunfighters breathing down his neck, Tom shot back. He was right. The defeat in court had changed the air in the gorge. The militia was still there, a token presence, but the authority had shifted. The Atchison men worked with a new swagger. The DNRG men worked with their heads down, waiting for the axe to fall. The axe fell 3 days later, not in the gorge, but in a telegram office in Denver. The news came down the wire and spread through the camps like a fever. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a stunningly fast decision on a related case, had issued a ruling. It wasn't on the Royal Gorge specifically, but on the nature of prior rights and federal land grants. The language was dense, full of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear as a gunshot. A railroad's prior survey of a route through public lands, even if not immediately developed, established a primary and defensible claim against later competitors. It reversed everything. Rip was with McMurtry when the telegram arrived. The chief engineer read the message, then read it again, his face a blank mask. He handed the paper to Rip without a word. "What is it?" Tom asked, seeing the look on their faces. "It's a different judge," Rip said. He read the last line aloud. DNRG's prior rights to Royal Gorge route are affirmed. AT&SF operations constitute trespass. Cease and desist order to follow. Tom stared, his mouth half open. "We won." "We won the war," McMurtry said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a loaded gun after a long fistfight. Now we have to win the peace. The news hit the Atchison camp like a physical blow. Rip rode to the rim of the gorge and watched as Robinson gathered his men. There was no shouting, no anger. Just a quiet, stunned disbelief. They had won. The law had been on their side. Now, a higher law, one from 1,000 miles away, had erased their victory. The celebration in the DNRG camp was a loud, drunken affair. Men who had been expecting to lose their jobs were now the undisputed kings of the canyon. McMurtry let them drink. He knew he would need them sober and ready in the morning. He found Rip by the supply wagons, cleaning his rifle, the celebratory noise of the camp a distant backdrop. "It's not over," Rip said without looking up. "No," McMurtry agreed. He had a bottle of whiskey in his hand, but hadn't opened it. "The court in Denver will uphold the Supreme Court's precedent. That will take days. In the meantime, the Atchison still has 70 of Masterson's gunslingers on their payroll. They still have men and equipment in the canyon. A piece of paper from Washington doesn't move them." "It gives us the authority," Rip said. "It gives us the excuse," McMurtry corrected him. His eyes were cold, calculating. "Palmer's already sent the wire. He's not waiting for the local court to act. He's done with lawyers. He's done with judges." He looked at Rip, and the surveyor saw the same look he'd seen the night they raced for Raton Pass, the look of a commander committing his troops to a final brutal charge. He's hired his own army. Rip worked the lever on his rifle, the sound a clean, metallic shink-shink in the quiet. He didn't need to ask who would lead it. McMurtry handed him a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a telegram. It was a list of names. Men scattered across the territory, former lawmen, ex-militia, a few hard cases with reputations. "You and Tom have 3 days to get to Denver, find these men and bring them back. Palmer's people will have the money and the contracts ready. We're not hiring 70. We're hiring 100. I want to outnumber them 2 to 1 when the local order comes down." Rip folded the paper and put it in his pocket. The legal victory wasn't the end. It was the signal for the real war to begin. He found Tom by the fire, laughing and sharing a bottle with some of the other surveyors. Rip pulled him aside. "We're riding for Denver," Rip said, his voice low. Tom's smile faded. What for? The party's here. The party's over, Rip said. Chapter 19. A piece of paper doesn't stop a bullet. The man's name was Degraff, and he was General Palmer's lawyer. He sat in the Denver office behind a desk clean enough to eat off of, his hands folded. He looked more like a preacher than a man who fought with injunctions. But it does give the man holding the gun a legal reason to pull the trigger. That's the difference now. Rip stood by the window, looking down at the city. It was a world away from the grit and smoke of the gorge. Tom Bradley sat in the chair opposite Degraff, the list of names McMurtry had given them resting on his knee. They had ridden for 2 days straight. So we're not hiring an army, Tom said. We're swearing them in as deputies. Precisely, Degraff said, a thin smile touching his lips. The local court in Pueblo County will issue the writ of enforcement tomorrow morning, citing the Supreme Court's precedent. Sheriff Miller will be legally obligated to assist the DNRG in reclaiming its property. Any resistance by the Atchison will be a criminal act. He looked at Rip. Your job is to provide the sheriff with enough concerned citizens to ensure his orders are followed without incident. And Masterson? Rip asked. Bat Masterson is a professional, Degraff said. He understands the difference between a corporate dispute and a felony. He will not fight a sheriff who holds a valid court order. His contract doesn't cover getting himself hanged. The ride back to Pueblo was faster. They weren't alone. They rode with 20 men from the list, hard-faced riders who had been waiting in Denver for a contract, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Palmer had paid. They met Sheriff Miller in his Canyon City office at dawn. He was a small man with a big mustache and worried eyes. The piece of paper from the court, stamped and signed, sat on his desk like a coiled snake. I'm a peace officer, Miller said, looking from Rip to the 20 men waiting outside. Not a general. This is a legal seizure, Sheriff, Rip said. We're here to back your authority, not to start a war. You tell that to Doc Holliday, Miller muttered. He picked up the writ and his hat. All right. Let's get this over with. They rode into Pueblo, with the rising sun at their backs. The town was quiet, but it was a waiting kind of quiet. Word had spread. The Atchison men were holed up in their headquarters, a fortified hotel near the rail yards. The DNRG roundhouse, the one they had fought and bled for, was still a ruin. Sheriff Miller, Rip, and Tom walked to the front of the hotel, leaving their small army of newly sworn deputies spread out across the street. I'm not going in there, Miller said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. You don't have to, Rip said. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Masterson. The second-story window opened. Bat Masterson looked down, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a cup of coffee. That's a lot of hardware for a morning call, Campbell, Masterson said. Sheriff Miller held up the court order. I have a writ from the 4th Judicial Circuit, ordering the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe to vacate all DNRG property in this county. That includes this hotel. Masterson looked from the paper to the men in the street. He saw the badges, the rifles, the cold, professional readiness. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The law is a funny thing. A week ago, it was on my side. The law changed its mind, Rip said. So it seems. Masterson looked down at Rip, and there was no animosity in his eyes. Only a kind of professional appraisal. A game had been played. A move had been made. You have an hour to clear the street. My men will be out by then. He closed the window. Sheriff Miller let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That's it. That's it, Rip said. He knows the game's over. They waited. The hour passed. Just as Masterson had promised, the front door of the hotel opened. The gunfighters came out, not in a rush, but one by one. Doc Holliday, his face pale, gave a thin, consumptive cough and tipped his hat as he walked past. Ben Thompson stared hard at Rip, a promise of a future meeting in his eyes. They were professionals, their contracts ended, their work done. They collected their horses and rode out of town without a backward glance, a quiet, dangerous river flowing out to find a new war. Masterson came out last. He stopped on the porch and looked at Rip. "You learn fast, Campbell," Masterson said. "You learned that a piece of paper is worth more than 100 guns if it's the right piece of paper." "I learned you have to be willing to use both," Rip said. Masterson almost smiled. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between two men on opposite sides of a finished battle. Then he turned and walked to his horse. Rip watched them go, the last of the hired army disappearing down the dusty street. Chapter 20. It's a graveyard. Tom Bradley stood on the rim of the Royal Gorge and looked down. The Atchison crews were gone. Their stone fort was abandoned, a crumbling monument to a failed campaign. The tools, the campfires, the men, all vanished. The canyon was quiet for the first time in months. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of exhaustion. McMurtry didn't answer. He was studying a new set of financial reports that had arrived from Denver, his face a mask of grim calculation. The legal victory had come at a price, and the bill was now due. Rip walked the DNRG work line. The crew was half the size it had been before the gunfighters arrived. The men who remained worked with a slow, weary rhythm, their faces showing the strain of the long conflict. The company had won, but the men looked defeated. "We're broke," McMurtry said, finally looking up from his papers. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was stating a fact to the uncaring mountains. The legal fees, the hired guns, the lost equipment, the double wages. Palmer is mortgaging the future of the company to pay for the last 3 months. He folded the papers with a sharp, angry motion. "We have the canyon, but we might not have enough money to lay the track through it." The victory celebration had lasted one night. Reality had set in with the morning sun. Ellen Morrison arrived 2 days later, not with supplies, but with her father. He was a man built of soft edges and hard numbers, his suit out of place in the rugged camp. He walked to the edge of the gorge with McMurtry, a predator surveying a wounded animal. "My congratulations on your legal success, Mr. McMurtry," Morrison said, his voice smooth. "A masterful stroke." "It was costly," McMurtry said, his tone clipped. "Of course," Morrison said. "Victory always is. Which is why I'm here. My sources in Denver tell me General Palmer is struggling to secure the final round of financing for the Leadville extension." Rip stood with Ellen a few yards away, watching the two men. "Your father doesn't waste time," Rip said. "He calls it seizing an opportunity," Ellen said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth it had once held. Her engagement to the Atchison investor was a settled fact, a business arrangement. She looked at the canyon, at the quiet work site. "He's here to offer a loan. At a very high interest rate." "A vulture," Tom muttered from nearby. "A banker," Ellen corrected him without malice. "He's betting you can't finish the line without his capital. And he's probably right." She was. McMurtry's meeting with Morrison ended with a grim handshake. The DNRG had a new, expensive partner. Later that evening, a telegraph runner brought a message from one of Palmer's men in Denver. Rip read it by the light of the campfire. "It's about the stock," Rip said to Tom. "Our price is down. Way down. The fight scared the investors. So we won the gorge and lost the company?" Tom asked, bitterness lacing his words. "Not just us," Rip said, reading the last line. "The Atchison stock is just as low." The wire says a third party is buying up shares in both companies. Quietly. Huge blocks of them for pennies on the dollar. Who? A man named Gould. Jay Gould. The name meant nothing to Tom, but Rip had heard it before, whispered in Denver saloons. A name associated with Wall Street, with stock manipulation, with the kind of financial warfare that made the Royal Gorge look like a schoolyard shoving match. Rip looked out at the dark, silent canyon. He saw it then. The fistfights, the stone forts, the hired guns, the dynamite, the court battles. They hadn't been the war. They had been a diversion. The real war was being fought in telegraph offices and stock exchanges by men they would never see. Men who didn't care who won the canyon, as long as both sides bled enough to make their companies cheap to buy. He crumpled the telegram in his fist. Masterson had been wrong. Chapter 21. So you're telling me the war was a lie? Tom Bradley sat at a table in a Denver hotel dining room that was too clean for the clothes they were wearing. He pushed a piece of steak around his plate with a fork. He hadn't eaten much. You're telling me the men who died, the dynamite, all of it, was just noise to make a rich man richer? I'm telling you the fight in the canyon wasn't the only fight, Rip said. He hadn't touched his food at all. He was drinking coffee, black and bitter. They had been in Denver for a day, waiting for a meeting with General Palmer that kept getting postponed. A man named Gould, Tom said, the name tasting like poison. A ghost in New York. And he owns us. He's trying to, Rip corrected. He doesn't own us yet. He looked out the window at the bustling street. Carriages and freight wagons. Men in suits and men in buckskin. The city was a machine, and the fuel was money. I need to know how he works. You going to ride to New York and ask him? Tom asked, his voice thick with sarcasm. No, Rip said. I'm going to the telegraph office. The Western Union office on Larimer Street was a hive of noise, the rhythmic chatter of a dozen telegraph keys, a constant metallic insect hum. Men in green eye shades sat hunched over their instruments, their fingers dancing, turning words into electricity. Rip didn't go to the main counter. He stood by the wall and watched. He was looking for a face that didn't fit. A man whose eyes weren't just on his own key. He found him in the corner. A young man, maybe 20, with thin hair and a nervous, twitchy energy. His key was silent more often than not, but his eyes were constantly scanning the room, reading the other messages, listening to the flow of information. He was a man who was paid to be a conduit, but wanted to be a source. Rip waited. At 6 o'clock, a bell rang, and the operators began to shut down their keys for the night. The young man was one of the last to leave. He came out into the cool evening air, pulling on a threadbare coat. Rip fell into step beside him. You're a reader. The young man jumped. He looked at Rip, at the hard, trail-worn face, and his first instinct was fear. I don't know what you're talking about. You read the tape, Rip said, his voice low. You see more than just your own messages. You see the patterns. They reached a corner saloon. Rip gestured with his head. Buy you a drink. The saloon was loud and smoky. They found a small table in the back. Rip bought a whiskey for the clerk and a beer for himself. You see the traffic from the stock exchanges, Rip said. He didn't ask a question. He stated a fact. The clerk took a long drink of his whiskey. It gave him a little courage. I see a lot of things. Coded messages. Buy orders. Sell orders. It's just noise. It's not noise to the men sending them, Rip said. A man named Jay Gould. You see his name? The clerk almost choked on his drink. He looked around, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with a stranger in a dark coat. I can't talk about that. That's private company business. The company you work for is about to be owned by him, Rip said. Along with the one I work for. He's playing both sides. He leaned forward. I've been in the gorge for months. I've seen men get killed. For what? So a man in an office 1,000 miles away can shave a few points off a stock price? He held the clerk's terrified gaze. I'm not the law. I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just need to understand the game. The clerk finished his whiskey in one gulp. He looked at the empty glass, then at Rip. He saw a man who wasn't asking for gossip. He saw a man who was asking for a piece of a map. You don't see his name, the clerk whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the saloon. Never. But you see his shadow. The orders come from a dozen different brokerage houses. But they all use the same private encryption key. An old Union Army cipher. He took a shaky breath. And the timing, it's perfect. A wire comes from Canyon City about a supply train being dynamited. The stock price for DNRG starts to fall. An hour later, a buy order for 10,000 shares comes through that cipher. Always on the dip. Always. And for the Atchison? Rip asked. The same, the clerk said. A legal setback in court, the stock wobbles. The buy orders come in. He looked at Rip, and the fear in his eyes was mixed with a kind of awe. He's not just buying stock. He's creating the events that make the stock cheap. He's playing the whole damn war like a fiddle. Rip leaned back. The pieces were all there now. The real battlefield wasn't in the Royal Gorge. It was here, in the hiss of electricity over a wire. The gunfighters, the dynamite, the dead men, they were just tools to manipulate the market. Pawns in a game so big, they couldn't even see the board. He stood up and put a silver dollar on the table. Enough for 2 more whiskeys. Thank you for your time, Rip said. He walked out of the saloon and stood on the boardwalk, the noise and the light spilling out behind him. The cool night air did nothing to chill the cold rage that had settled in his gut. His enemy wasn't Robinson. It wasn't Masterson. Chapter 22. He's using an old Union Army cipher. General Palmer stood at the window of his suite in the Windsor Hotel, his back to the room. He didn't turn. He just watched the carriages move on the street below, a river of commerce and progress. And you believe this, clerk? I believe the numbers, Rip said. He stood across the room, near the door, a man who didn't belong in a place with velvet curtains and upholstered chairs. Tom Bradley sat in one of those chairs, his hands clenched on his knees, looking from Palmer to Rip and back again. Every time there's violence in the gorge, our stock falls. Every time the Atchison has a legal setback, their stock falls. And every time, this ghost in New York buys. He's not betting on a winner, General. He's betting on the fight. Palmer turned from the window. He was a man used to commanding armies, to giving orders that moved men and mountains. The idea that he had been a pawn, his strategies and victories just noise to manipulate a number on a stock ticker, was a new and unwelcome kind of defeat. Jay Gould. I've had dealings with the man. He's a serpent. He poisons the well, and then sells the water back to you. This time he dynamited the well, Tom said, his voice a low, angry growl. Patterson and Henderson are dead, so this Gould could save a few dollars on a stock purchase. It's more than a few dollars, Palmer said, walking to a side table where a decanter of brandy sat. He poured a glass, his hand steady. It's control. He's acquiring a controlling interest in both companies, for pennies on the dollar. When the dust settles, he'll own the winner no matter who wins. He took a drink, the fire of it doing nothing to warm the cold fury in his eyes. He played us. He played the Atchison. He played the whole damn state of Colorado. There was a soft knock at the door. An aide, a young man with a face full of worried numbers, stepped in. General. The revised payroll lists you asked for. He handed Palmer a sheaf of papers. Palmer scanned the top page, his expression hardening. How many? 47, sir, the aide said, not meeting his eyes. From the Gorge cruise. McMurtry says we can't sustain the current wage roll, not with the interest payments due on the Morrison loan. Palmer handed the list to Tom. See that it's done. Tom took the papers, his face going pale as he read the names. Garrett is on this list. Paulson. These men have been with us from the start. And they will be the first to be rehired when our financial situation improves, Palmer said, his voice a flat, final line. The subject was closed. The aide slipped out of the room, leaving the list of names on the table like a death sentence. Rip walked out of the hotel. The air on the street was cool, but he felt like he was suffocating. He had fought men, built forts, seized rail yards. He knew how to win that kind of war. This new one, fought with ledgers and stock certificates, was a ghost he couldn't get his hands on. He saw her across the street, coming out of a dusty second-rate boarding house, the kind of place that charged by the week. Ellen Morrison. She wasn't wearing the fine dresses he had seen her in before. She wore a simple, practical skirt and blouse, and she was carrying a basket of groceries. He crossed the street. Ellen. She looked up, and the surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a kind of weary resignation. The spark, the fire he had seen in her before, was gone. Mr. Campbell. I heard you were in town. Your father's loan. Rip started, not sure what to say. A bitter smile touched her lips. My father made a bad bet. He thought he was a shark, swimming with other sharks. He didn't realize there was a whale in the water. She shifted the basket in her arms. Gould didn't just squeeze the railroads. He squeezed their suppliers. My father's contracts were suddenly worthless. His credit was gone overnight. The engagement to Mr. Whitmore was reconsidered. It seems a bankrupt freight heiress is not the asset she once was. She said it all with a flat, detached calm, the voice of a person who has lost everything so fast they haven't had time to feel it yet. Where are you staying? Rip asked. Here, she said, nodding toward the boarding house. My father is unwell. I'm managing what's left. She looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of the old fire returned. This is the real war, isn't it? Not the one in the canyon. It's this. The quiet ruin. The numbers in a book that can destroy a man's life from 1,000 miles away. I'm sorry, Rip said. The words were useless, but they were all he had. Don't be, she said. She looked down at the basket of bread and vegetables. For the first time in my life, I'm not a business asset. I'm just a woman buying groceries. She gave him a small, sad smile. There's a strange kind of freedom in it. She turned and walked into the boarding house, leaving Rip standing on the boardwalk. He watched the door close behind her. He thought of Tom, having to tell 47 men they no longer had a job. He thought of the dead men, their lives spent to shave a few points off a stock price. He walked away from the boarding house, his stride long and purposeful. He knew what he had to do. You couldn't fight a ghost with a gun. You couldn't fight a telegraph wire with your fists. Chapter 23. The money stopped. Ben Thompson threw a deck of cards onto the saloon table, the pasteboard scattering. He wasn't angry. He was bored. Across from him, Dirty Dave Rudabout didn't look up from cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. The money always stops. The Copper Dollar Saloon was quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. Most of Masterson's army had already drifted out of Canyon City, a slow evaporation of talent now that the Atchison paymasters had closed their books. The ones who remained were the professionals, the names, waiting for a final word from their commander. Rip Campbell pushed through the batwing doors, and the low murmur of conversation in the room died for a second before restarting, a little quieter than before. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was a piece of history, the other side of a war that had ended with the whisper of a telegraph key instead of the roar of a cannon. He saw him at the back table, the same one he always took. Bat Masterson. He was alone, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him, staring at the grain of the wood. Rip walked the length of the bar, his boots making a sound on the floorboards that was different now. Not a challenge. Just a man walking. He stopped at Masterson's table. "Campbell," Masterson said without looking up. "Come to watch the vultures leave the carcass?" "I came to see the man who led them," Rip said. Masterson finally raised his eyes. They were clear, tired, and held a kind of weary amusement. He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down. The whiskey's paid for." Rip sat. The chair creaked. The silence between them stretched, not with tension, but with a shared understanding. "Your man Gould," Masterson said, breaking the quiet. "He plays a deep game." "He's not my man," Rip said. "No," Masterson agreed. "He's not anybody's man, is he? He's the house. And the house always wins." He picked up his glass and looked at the amber liquid. "I got the wire from the Atchison board yesterday. My services, and those of my associates, are no longer required. It seems the war has become too expensive to be profitable." "It always was," Rip said. "That was the point." Masterson almost smiled. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I figured as much, about a month ago. When they ordered the dynamite. It was a messy, loud move. Not surgical. It was designed to scare investors, not win a canyon." He set the glass down. "I was never hired to win the Royal Gorge, was I? I was hired to make sure you didn't win it too cheaply. And to give a man in New York a reason to buy stock on the dip," Rip finished for him. "There you have it," Masterson said. He looked around the quiet saloon, at the last of his hired guns, men like Thompson and Rudabaugh, restless predators with no war to fight. "It was good work, though. A shame it was all for a ghost." "What happens now?" Rip asked. Now the professionals find new work," Masterson said. He nodded toward Thompson. "A man like Ben can't sit still for long. He'll find a card game in Texas that needs settling." He looked toward Rudabaugh, who was now testing the edge of his knife on his thumb. "Dave will drift south. I hear the Atchison is laying track into New Mexico. New towns, new money. New opportunities for a man with his particular skill set." The words hung in the air. The war wasn't over. The soldiers were just being redeployed. "And you?" Rip asked. "Me?" Masterson looked down at his hands, at the hands of a man who had been a lawman, a gambler, a killer. "I'm a businessman, Campbell. This was a contract. The contract is over." He finished his whiskey and stood up, the movement fluid, final. "I'm for Leadville. I hear the gambling is good." He put on his hat and looked down at Rip. There was no animosity in his eyes. Only the cool, detached respect of one professional for another. "You fought well. For a man who builds things instead of breaking them." "You too," Rip said. Masterson nodded once. He walked to the front of the saloon, said a few quiet words to Thompson and the others, and then pushed through the doors and was gone. Rip sat at the table and watched the rest of them leave. One by one, they gathered their gear and walked out into the afternoon sun. Thompson gave Rip a long, hard stare before he left, a promise filed away for another time. Rudabaugh just grinned, a flash of white teeth in a dark beard, and followed him out. Rip was alone in the saloon with the bartender and the ghosts. He looked at the untouched glass of whiskey Masterson had left. He thought of the dead men. He thought of Tom in Denver, trying to find work for 47 men whose jobs had been sacrificed for a stock price. He thought of Ellen, her future sold to pay for a war that was a lie. He stood up and walked to the batwing doors. Outside, the last of the gunfighters were mounting their horses. A ragged, dangerous army, now disbanded, scattering to the four corners of the West to find new trouble or to make it. He watched as a small group of them, Rudabaugh and John Joshua Webb among them, turned their horses not east or west but south, toward New Mexico. Rip stood in the doorway, the sun warm on his face, and felt a cold, hard certainty settle in his gut. The railroad war was over. But the violence it had unleashed was just getting started. Chapter 24. So where does a ghost go when the war is over? Tom Bradley stood on the platform of the Canyon City Depot, a ticket to Denver in his hand. He looked different in a clean shirt and a town coat, like a man trying on a costume he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. Back to the graveyard? The war isn't over, Rip said. He was watching a crew of DNRG men work on a section of track, their movements slow, methodical, no longer driven by the frantic urgency of the fight. It just moved. Palmer's sending you south, Tom said. It wasn't a question. Chasing phantoms for a man who's already won. The Atchison is building a new main line through New Mexico, Rip said. Palmer wants to know how fast. He wants to know where their feeder lines are going. He wants a map of their new kingdom. Tom shook his head, a gesture of weary disbelief. It never ends, does it? One canyon is won, so you start looking at the next mountain range. He held out his hand. You take care of yourself, Rip. There's only so many wars a man can walk away from. They shook, the grip hard and final. Tom climbed aboard the train, found a seat by a window, and didn't look back. The whistle blew, and the train pulled away, a slow, chuffing retreat from the battlefield. Rip watched it go, until it was just a smudge of smoke against the mountains. Then he walked to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode south. The country changed. The high, jagged peaks of Colorado gave way to the flat, sun-baked mesas and endless sky of New Mexico. This was Atchison territory now. The survey stakes were theirs. The land grants were theirs. Every water tower and section house was a monument to their victory at Raton Pass. He rode into Las Vegas 2 days later, and it was like riding into a fever dream. The railroad had split the town in two. On one side was the old adobe plaza, a relic of a slower, quieter time. On the other side, a raw, sprawling new town had erupted from the dirt, a chaotic jumble of raw lumber, canvas tents, and false-fronted buildings that smelled of fresh-cut pine and stale whiskey. This was the railroad's town. New town. It was a town with no law, only opportunity. Rip rode down the main street, a river of mud and men. He saw prospectors, cattlemen, gamblers, and women whose trade was advertised in the tired, knowing look in their eyes. And he saw them. They were in the saloons, on the street corners, their hats tipped low, their hands never far from their guns. They moved with the lazy, predatory confidence of men who had been paid to be dangerous and had found they liked the work. Rudabaugh, Webb, Mather, the scattered remnants of Masterson's army. They had followed the rails south to the end of the line where the money was new and the rules hadn't been written yet. Rip tied his horse in front of a saloon called the Imperial, a 2-story clapboard palace that was already doing a brisk business in the middle of the afternoon. He went in, not for a drink, but for the same reason a wolf goes to a water hole, to see what other predators had claimed the territory. The air was thick with smoke, and the low hum of a dozen different conversations. He stood at the bar and ordered a beer he didn't want. In the dusty back bar mirror, he saw them. Dirty, Dave Rudabaugh was at a table with 3 other men, a deck of cards in his hand, a pile of coins in front of him. He wasn't playing. He was holding court. A man with a tin star on his vest, a local constable with fear in his eyes, walked up to the table. "Now, Dave," the constable said, his voice a nervous placation. "The merchants have been complaining about your boys collecting contributions." Rudabout didn't look up from his cards. "It's a tax, Marshal. For keeping the peace." He finally raised his eyes, and they were flat and cold as a snake's. "And the peace is being kept, ain't it?" The constable swallowed. He looked around the saloon, at the hard-faced men watching him. He nodded once, a small, defeated gesture, and backed away. Rip turned from the bar and walked toward the table. The conversation died as he approached. Rudabout looked up, and a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He recognized him. "Well, look here," Rudabout said, his voice a low growl that carried across the room. "It's the surveyor. Come down to stake a claim on our new town." "Just passing through," Rip said. "That's what you said in the gorge," Rudabout said. "But you didn't pass through, did you? You stayed. You caused a lot of trouble." He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the table, a few inches from his pistol. "This ain't the gorge, surveyor. There ain't no militia here. No court orders. Just us." John Joshua Webb, sitting across from Rudabout, pushed his chair back, his hand dropping to his side. The other men at the table went still. Rip didn't look at Webb. He kept his eyes on Rudabout. "The war is over." Rudabout laughed, a short, harsh sound. "The war ain't never over. It just finds new ground." He gestured with his chin to the raw, bustling street outside. "This is the new ground. And we got here first." Rip held his gaze for a long moment. He saw the truth of it in the man's cold, confident eyes. The violence hadn't been defeated. It had just been relocated. He nodded once, a slow acknowledgement. He turned his back on the table and walked out of the saloon, the silence of the room a physical weight against his shoulders. He could feel their eyes on him, a dozen gunslingers who had once been his enemy and were now something else. Something worse. The new law. He stepped out into the street and untied his horse. He stood there for a moment, looking at the half-finished buildings, at the railroad tracks that disappeared into the vast empty horizon. He pulled a notebook from his saddlebag, the one he used for survey reports, and began to write. Chapter 25. It is, after all, a matter of economic reality. The man's name was Charles Perkins, and he was the vice president of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table in a suite at Boston's Parker House Hotel, a silk handkerchief perched in his breast pocket. The room smelled of old money, cigar smoke, and the self-satisfaction of men who moved empires with the stroke of a pen. General Palmer, his uniform replaced by a severe black suit, sat opposite him. "The reality, Mr. Perkins, is that my company holds a Supreme Court decision affirming our prior rights to the Royal Gorge. A reality that has proven ruinously expensive for both of us to enforce," Perkins countered smoothly. He gestured with a clean, manicured hand. "We are not here to relitigate the past. We are here to divide the future." Rip Campbell stood by the window, his back to the room. He watched the alien landscape of an eastern city move below, a river of black carriages, men in top hats, and newsboys hawking papers. The noise was different here. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, but the dull, constant roar of commerce. He felt like a ghost, a piece of the savage West brought here to stand as a silent, uncomfortable reminder of what this meeting was really about. He had been in Boston for a week, a guest of General Palmer's, a witness to the final act. The meetings had been a slow, grinding negotiation, a war fought with balance sheets and territorial maps instead of guns and dynamite. The name Jay Gould was never spoken, but his shadow fell across every ledger, every concession. Both companies were wounded, bleeding capital, and Gould was the shark circling, waiting for one of them to die. This treaty wasn't a peace agreement. It was a survival pact. The Denver and Rio Grande will retain exclusive rights to the Royal Gorge and all routes north to Leadville, Palmer stated, his voice the crisp tone of a commander dictating terms of surrender. In exchange, Perkins replied, the Atchison will have unimpeded rights to Raton Pass and all routes extending into New Mexico and Arizona. Agreed. Rip turned from the window. The men at the table, Palmer, Perkins, lawyers, investors, were carving up the West like a Thanksgiving turkey. A line was drawn on a map. The Royal Gorge, a place where men had died, was now a blue line belonging to the DNRG. Raton Pass, where the first race had been lost, was a red line belonging to the AT&SF. It was all so clean. So simple. Furthermore, Palmer continued, the DNRG will pay the Atchison $1.4 million for the improvements and grading already completed in the gorge. A steep price for a trespasser's labor, one of Palmer's lawyers muttered. It is the price of peace, Perkins said, his eyes on Palmer. And it ensures Mr. Gould's associates, who hold a significant portion of our debt, are satisfied. There it was. The ghost in the room. The money wasn't for the Atchison. It was for Gould. A tribute paid to the man who had orchestrated the entire war. They went on like that for another hour, the lawyers scribbling notes, the executives making concessions that were measured in millions of dollars and thousands of miles of track. They talked about freight rates and lease agreements and bond issues. They never talked about Tom Bradley's ribs or the men killed by dynamite. They never talked about the families whose lives had been ruined or the gunfighters who had been scattered south to start new wars. That wasn't on the balance sheet. Finally, Perkins stood up. Gentlemen, I believe we have an agreement. He pushed a newly drafted document to the center of the table. Palmer read it, his face a mask of grim acceptance. He picked up a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed his name with a sharp, decisive stroke. Perkins countersigned. Hands were shaken. Glasses of whiskey were poured. The war was over. Palmer walked over to Rip, a glass in his hand. We did it, Campbell. We saved the company. You saved what was left of it, Rip said. Palmer's expression tightened. This is a victory. We hold the route to the richest silver mines in the world. We survived. How many of the men I worked with in the gorge still have a job? Rip asked. The question hung in the air, an unwelcome piece of grit in the smooth machinery of the celebration. Palmer didn't have an answer. He looked at Rip, at the hard, unyielding set of his jaw, and he saw a man who didn't fit in this room. A man who still thought the war was about the canyon. Your service has been invaluable, Palmer said, his voice turning formal, distant. The company is prepared to offer you a permanent position as chief of surveying for the entire Leadville extension. Rip looked at the men in the room, at their satisfied smiles and their clean hands. He thought of Ellen, selling groceries in a Denver boarding house. He thought of Tom, looking for work. He thought of the telegraph clerk, whose quiet truth had revealed the whole rotten game. No, Rip said. He turned his back on the general, on the smell of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey, on the quiet, bloodless victory. He walked out of the room, leaving the architects of the New West to their celebration. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew it wasn't with them. He stepped out of the hotel and into the unfamiliar noise of the Boston street, a man who had run out of wars to fight.